The next page is the cover that launched a legend. It's April 1997, requiring £2.95 of your hard-earned pocket money, and there is Mario, smugly staring from his 64-bit kingdom. Back then, this wasn't just a rag, it was our gateway to the future. With headlines teasing the dynamite thrills of Turok, the inevitable local multiplayer addiction that is Mario Kart 64, and a tantalizing whisper of Zelda 64, this issue perfectly captured the giddy hysteria of early console gaming. It is crisp, vibrant, and perfectly sells the promise that the revolution had well and truly arrived in our living rooms. And next, the left-hand advert for Superstar Wars on the SNES and Game Boy at Woolworths is simply dated history, a blast from the past we really do not need to dwell on. On the right, however, we find the editorial mission statement, the sheer unbridled confidence of 1997 media. Before us sits the 10 Commandments of N64 Magazine. It reads like a list of New Year's resolutions drafted by an optimistic team that was genuinely convinced it was about to change the world. They promised, cross their hearts, to never engage in tedious waffle or produce fluffy, padded reviews. How noble! Of course, we all know the reality of print media is usually buoyed by more advertising than content, but let's look past that for a moment, shall we? This wasn't just a magazine launch, it was an act of aggressive positioning. You can almost feel the editors patting themselves on the back, insisting they were the most skillful reviewers in existence. Whether they actually managed to play every game through to the end, no matter how hard they were, even when the camera angles turned malicious, remains a fair question to ask. I suspect more than a few controllers were treated poorly when things got exceptionally tricky in the early titles, but the intent was clearly to drag us into the modern era with a stern, authoritative gaze. The premise that they would be completely independent and happy to label a bad game exactly what it was, a load of rubbish, was, at the time, quite bold. Back then, reading a review felt like checking in with an oracle. We were desperate for someone to tell us what to spend our pocket money on, and here was a publication volunteering to be our primary guide through the low poly count and frame rates of this brave new world. It sets the scene perfectly. Clear, concise, and holding the controller with the distinct grip of someone ready to define how we consume gaming culture. They were perhaps a bit full of themselves, but in the nascent, thrilling landscape of the Nintendo 64, we were just pleased to believe everything on the horizon was going to be truly brilliant. The next page is your quintessential contents breakdown, anchored by Mario looking absurdly triumphant, as if he knew he'd single-handedly defined the console. It's a navigational chart for that first wave of N64 excitement, the sheer brilliance of Super Mario 64, the gritty, blocky violence of Turok, and imported oddities like J-League Perfect Striker. It also introduces the Team 64 editorial crew, looking terribly young and earnest, blissfully unaware of the impending deadline-fueled madness. It's all very structured and sensible, everything a budding fan needed to find the highlights without sifting through the dross. The next page takes us directly into the cockpit of the game everyone was losing their minds over, in the spring of '97. It is, of course, the Star Fox 64 feature, or Lilat Wars, as the branding office back home would eventually have to force us to call it. There is an unmistakable air of about time then in the write-up. We had spent months gazing lovingly at Super Mario 64 and the polished sheen of Wave Race, all while desperately looking for something, anything else, that truly pushed the console to show what the silicon graphics hardware could actually handle. Nintendo had been walking on a razor's edge trying to turn 16-bit successes into 3D legends without breaking the spell. The article takes a predictably cautious stance on the transition. We're treated to shots of the infamous Slippy Toad, who remains even here a constant source of frustration. You remember, don't you? You're inches away from executing a perfect barrel roll and tearing through an enemy fighter, and that screeching green headache pops up on the screen, pleading for you to drag his sorry tail out of the fire. The magazine makes a fair point about the bosses. In the era of pixel art sprites, these screen-filling monstrosities were the real deal, effectively towering over the Arwing like a metallic nightmare. What strikes you most about this layout, looking back, is the obsession with freedom. You hear this constant grumbling in the review about how the original game was on rails. It's such a reductive way to view it. The text seems to worry that fans would be put off because they weren't in an open sandbox, but frankly, we were perfectly happy with an on-rails shooter, provided it was intense, responsive, and packed with secrets. The article does an admirable job of trying to hype up the variety. It promises us distinct planet types and enough branching paths to ensure you'd actually need to replay the game, which, let's be honest, was a rare luxury in 1997. It's amusing to see the early blocky renderings of Fox McCloud and the gang in the corner, posing with that distinct mid-90s aesthetic that screams future technology with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. You could almost hear the excitement through the text, as if the editors knew that Star Fox 64 was the vital shot in the arm the console required. While the gaming public spent months worrying if the lack of expansive, open-world roaming would hamper the title, it was glaringly obvious that the actual gameplay, the raw, adrenaline-fueled dogfighting, was going to hold up. This was high-octane, screen-filling chaos in the best way possible, and frankly the console needed this hit just to stay relevant in the eyes of everyone doubting Nintendo's direction. The next segment finds us smack bang in the middle of pre-release frenzy for Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars as the powers that be decided we needed to call it, lest we be confused by a simple title. You really get a sense here that the journalists were just as desperate for a decent, action-packed shooter to hit the shelves as everyone else. The entire layout is dripping with that classic, breathless enthusiasm peculiar to 97, that desperate need to prove the hardware was worth the heavy price tag of admission. There is a rather adorable inclusion here of what the editors are calling the Jolt Pack. Yes, they genuinely seem to think it would launch under the moniker of the Premier Jolt Pack, with an estimated price point of 15 quid. Imagine that. It is worth remembering that, at the time, the idea of a plastic block slotting into your controller to make the whole thing rattle and shudder whenever you hit a wall was treated like some sort of profound scientific leap forward, rather than a rudimentary feature that would eventually just chew through batteries. They were salivating at the prospect of feeling their thumbs turn to jelly while playing, and looking at this text, you can almost hear the giddy excitement surrounding such a gimmick. Then, there is the coverage of the Warrington cool cinemas. It is profoundly funny to read through this with a modern eye. The writers are waxing lyrical about the cinematic quality of these blocky, jagged, low-polygon animations. Back then though, you couldn't look away. They really were selling the idea that these clunky animations represented the absolute bleeding edge of virtual technology. You get the distinct impression that if a box simply appeared on screen to spell out, boom, it would have been considered groundbreaking special effects. The most aggressive part of this write-up is the section dedicated to character building, where the magazine takes a decidedly blunt and, honestly, slightly unhinged approach to summarizing our cast of woodland fighters. The write-up for General Pepper describes him as an old croat, while poor old Peppy gets slapped with a backstory involving, of all things, myxomatosis. It is remarkably mean-spirited, in a very British, witty way that really doesn't fly in marketing material these days. Slippy remains the butt of every joke, presented as the bug-eyed liability he always was. As for the 4-player functionality, that is where the real anticipation sat. People didn't just want to soar through space, they wanted to lock 4 people into a room, turn off the lights, and settle scores. The screenshot captions try hard to sell this as the ultimate test of skill, conveniently ignoring the fact that keeping track of 4 small boxes of low-res space dogfighting was less about precision aiming and more about squinting until you developed a migraine. Still, it is easy to see why the console owners of the day were practically biting at the bit. It promised the intensity and multiplayer brawling that turned your living room into the ultimate digital battlefield. The next double-page spread sees the editorial team clearly suffering from a serious bout of cabin fever, specifically aimed at Nintendo's utter failure to actually release the one game everyone was selling their own grandmothers to play, The Legend of Zelda 64. This wasn't just a game release back then, it was the second coming, the absolute pivot point where gaming history shifted on its axis, yet looking at this coverage you get a genuine sense of how exhausting the anticipation actually was. The title says it all, doesn't it? We're missing Link. It wasn't just a cute play on words, it was the prevailing mood of the British gaming public in early 1997. Everyone was convinced they'd be playing the definitive Zelda experience by the time their Christmas turkeys hit the oven, but Nintendo's release schedules were, even back then, about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. The page does a cracking job of capturing the collective groan over the will they won't they nonsense surrounding the 64DD drive. At the time, Nintendo were adamant that the Zelda masterpiece would launch on their proprietary disk drive, an expensive plastic paperweight that most sane people knew was destined for the scrap heap. When they finally relented and confirmed it would just be a regular cartridge, the collective sigh of relief was audible from London to Kyoto. Looking at these screenshots with a modern eye is frankly hilarious. You've got these grainy, razor-sharp, low-polygon count graphics, and yet at the time, these grainy blobs of pixels were treated like genuine fine art. There is a screenshot here of the skeletons in a town setting that's clearly marked with a tongue-in-cheek caption, but the genuine concern of the writer shines through. They were actually worried. You remember the sentiment, don't you? There was a gnawing anxiety that, in the leap from 2D sprites to 3D movement, the series might lose its heart. Would a kidnapping-prone Zelda still work in 3 dimensions? Would the puzzle solving that we adored in the 2D entries just become a sluggish chore when you had to wrestle with a Z-target system that didn't technically exist in the minds of the public yet? The write-up itself is typical of the era, desperately grasping at clues. They are trying to divine the game's future mechanics, based on a handful of pictures showing nothing but some weird, wobbly enemies, and Link standing around in a town square looking utterly lost. They call them welly-wearing skeletons, which, to be fair, is an accurate and brutal description of some of the enemy models from that alpha build. It's that exact sort of dry, slightly biting commentary that kept you reading back then. The editors weren't just sycophants, they were just as frustrated by the wait as the readers, and they weren't afraid to let their annoyance drip from the page. And then, stuck to the side, we have the Time Bandit recap, a quick jog through the franchise's history. It's quaint, isn't it? Mentions of the NES originals, and that little cartridge of Link's Awakening for the Game Boy. It feels almost prehistoric, compared to the promise of the big, ambitious 3D adventure, staring back from the rest of the page. It's essentially telling us to remember where we came from, while we sat here biting our nails for the next technological leap. We were stuck in 1997, staring at static screenshots of what would become the industry's greatest ever adventure, fully unaware that the wait would be so worth it. The audacity to print a "to be continued" at the bottom feels less like a hook, and more like a cruel taunt. You bet we would be waiting. We didn't have much of a choice, did we? This page brings us face to face with a rather peculiar piece of software that, by all rights, shouldn't have been the riot it was. Rare's demolition masterpiece, Blast Corps. The magazine's intro doesn't waste time pulling punches, tossing a stinging bit of shade at Killer Instinct Gold by calling it uninspiring, effectively clearing the room for their new favorite weird project. It's a classic move from the editorial desk, really. They weren't just here to shill, they were here to be the first to call a dud, which makes their praise for Blast Corps actually hold some weight. The premise remains as delightfully ludicrous now as it was then. You're tasked with saving the planet, not by some grand martial arts duel or heroic platforming leap, but by functioning as a one-person demolition crew for a runaway, leaking, nuclear-toting train. The game turns the player into a total liability to the municipal authorities, giving us free rein to level downtown city blocks because, frankly, the train needs a clear track. You've got to admire that level of destruction as a gameplay hook. In an age where everything was trying to find its feet in 3D, here was a game that just decided the most fun you could have was breaking things. Looking at these screenshots is a bit of a time capsule. Sure, those buildings look like piles of monochromatic block stacking, but you can't deny the raw satisfaction we all felt when you'd find that perfect vehicle, whether it was the dump truck power of Backlash, or the bizarre jump jet capability of the J-Bomb, and just bring the whole structure down around your ears. The write-up makes a valid point about the sheer, frustrating addictiveness of the game's smaller tasks, like pushing boxes with a tractor, which on paper sounds about as fun as watching paint dry, yet in practice we spent hours obsessively shuffling crates around like a warehouse employee having a breakdown. The consensus at the time, mirrored nicely in this text, was that Blast Corps was the perfect palate cleanser. While everyone was clutching their pearls waiting for news on when Mario might eventually have another adventure, or when Nintendo would stop toying with their 64DD peripherals, Rare was off in their own corner making something fundamentally weird. It didn't have to change the world, it just had to give us an afternoon of high-octane city-leveling mayhem. You get the sense reading this, that the staff genuinely liked the break from the usual platforming grind. It was Rare playing with digital explosives, waiting for their chance to return to their Donkey Kong throne, but delivering something truly original in the interim. The to-be-continued tag is standard magazine fluff, but for a title as bizarre and gripping as this, you didn't mind the wait. If you were looking for a game to just shut your brain off with, while the world obsessed over future blockbuster releases, this was precisely the sort of medicine we all needed. The next page brings us into the frantic, frenzied reality of April 1997, marking the exact moment the British gaming public collectively lost its mind over the arrival of the Nintendo 64. It perfectly encapsulates that classic, desperate pre-internet era hysteria. When you look at the headline claiming the machine was selling like hotcakes, you really have to appreciate the sheer, glorious misery of the situation. 20,000 units across the entire UK. That wouldn't even cover the pre-orders in a mid-sized town nowadays, but back then, it was treated like the Holy Grail. It makes you chuckle thinking about those shivering masses queuing outside an electronics boutique on a wet Saturday, convinced their lives would be meaningless if they didn't snag one of the few boxes that had graced our shores. The coverage of these first owners is a treat of mid-90s social commentary, You can feel the relief and smug satisfaction radiating from the chaps selected for the feature. They weren't just playing games, they were status symbols in the making, and it's adorable watching them try to justify the expense, clutching their new machines as if they'd personally negotiated the import deals with Kyoto themselves. It was an exclusive club, and if you weren't holding that odd-looking trident-shaped plastic monstrosity in your hands, you were effectively a peasant in the gaming ecosystem. Jonathan Davies, editorial "A word in your shell"-like, adds that characteristic touch of magazine arrogance that defined the era. You can practically smell the smugness as the editorial team reminisces about having played Super Mario 64 and Pilotwings 64 long before the rest of us plebeians got a sniff. They had spent weeks living with the software while the readers were likely reading their earlier issues with drool running down their chins, dying for a taste of that three-dimensional freedom. They aren't wrong about the transformative power of those early titles, though. The transition to the N64 was essentially a total reset button for our expectations, and this text perfectly validates why we all collectively decided to put up with the ridiculous limited software lineup during those first few agonizing months. Tucked away in the corner is a section titled "The Alternative," where the magazine spares absolutely no one when it comes to the rubbish accessories manufacturers thought we would actually spend our hard-earned cash on. Whether it's those plasticky bargain bin controllers that felt like they were held together by gum and hope, or cassette cases meant to organize games that looked more like tomb-like plastic monoliths, it's a solid reminder of how third-party hardware developers rushed to cash in on our gullibility. It was pure landfill filler, and it is honestly refreshing to see the magazine be so brutal about it from the jump. If it wasn't the real deal, it was clearly destined to end up forgotten in a charity shop bargain bin by the following Christmas, and the authors made sure we knew exactly how garbage those plastic peripheral disasters really were. It was the perfect opening salvo, telling us exactly who was driving the ship, and frankly, we were all too busy worrying about finding a store with stock to argue with their assessment. The next page wades straight into the fragmented reality of global console adoption in the spring of Melee, 97, accompanied by some rather desperate-looking accessory advertisements. Trash like extender boxes or unnecessary adapter cables were really just fancy ways for local shops to nick an extra $5 from your pocket for tech you definitely didn't need. We find ourselves looking at the stark contrast between the markets. You've got Jonathan Davies writing from Tokyo about Japan going a bit quiet, clearly feeling the creeping pressure of the competition, a certain Final Fantasy VII-shaped problem that would define that era, while over in America, they're engaging in a delightful scrap for limited hardware, living through that short-lived age where a piece of consumer electronics actually required a brawl at a toy store. It's hilarious looking back at the disconnect. In one market, they're starving for machines, while in the other, they're becoming a specialized niche for the dedicated fan. Then, there's the big announcement regarding the 64DD. Reading this is like visiting an alternate timeline of pure, unadulterated hope. We were told this magnetic disc, internet-ready peripheral would be the extraordinary evolution of the console, offering everything from customizable SimCity worlds to modems, expansion tracks for Mario Kart 64, and a version of Zelda 64 that would surely change our lives. The sheer, wide-eyed sincerity of the tech journalism here is staggering. They treat this doomed proprietary curiosity as the inevitable future. It was supposed to break open the constraints of the cartridge format, providing us with a playground of custom, connected gaming. Of course, history shows us the 64DD became little more than a dust-collecting Japan-only curiosity that failed to change the world as much as it changed the spare change in Nintendo's coffers. It was marketing theater, of course, designed to make us feel like the ground beneath our feet was constantly shifting towards something better. And let's talk about that N64 videocassette. Everyone remembers these glorious artifacts. Getting a free tape glued to your magazine cover was peak prestige. Popping that into your VCR to watch flickering, pre-recorded footage of Pilotwings 64, Wave Race 64, and the anticipation for Star Fox 64 was about as close to digital media consumption as we could get. These were the trailers that convinced us, week after week, that the drought of software was a myth. Whether it was the arcade-perfect aggression of Killer Instinct Gold, or the teasing mention of GoldenEye, which was still in a painful limbo without a solid release date, these tapes were the heroine of the 90s gamer. You'd watch them until the tape physically degraded, genuinely convinced that your box of tricks under the TV was the only piece of tech worth owning, even if, realistically, you were just waiting for a game library that felt perpetually, agonizingly around the corner. The next page drags us firmly out of the bedroom and into the muddy, tire-screeching wilderness, serving up a spread dedicated entirely to the frantic scramble for rally games on the N64. Back in the spring of '97, if you owned an N64, your software library was arguably about as thin as the average tabloid, and our desperate need to fill that void led us to salivate over just about anything with four wheels. We were living in a peculiar vacuum where simply having an analog stick and a license for some off-road textures felt like cutting-edge simulation, even if the result usually meant battling that signature N64 fog that conveniently obscured every track, like the rolling mists of Dartmoor. We start with Sata's Rev Limit, a game that, with hindsight, mostly functions as a reminder that not everything pitched with a real-life damage model actually managed to survive the jump from the drawing board. The article carries that distinct tone of hesitant optimism. They knew the industry needed content, and they were clutching at straws, hoping this title would possess some semblance of grace on the tracks. You have to appreciate the audacity of the marketing here, touted for its potential handling of the analog stick, as if the controller was the magical solution to turning a mediocre experience into a triumph. In truth, looking back at these titles is a stark reminder of the wild west of game development, where we were essentially sold promises, grainy, pre-rendered static screenshots, and the distant, fuzzy hope of decent frame rates. Then there is Multi-Racing Championship, MRC, which was being hailed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty simply because it promised to bring us a Sega Rally-esque experience. It was Ocean publishing it, and let's be honest, you always approached an Ocean title with a cocktail of cautious excitement and dread. It was an ambitious claim for the time. Everyone was chasing that arcade-perfect feel, trying to cram the blistering pace of a coin-op machine into a cartridge, without having it stutter the moment three cars appeared on screen simultaneously. It is quite endearing, really, watching the reviewers try to act as hype men for a title that had all the visibility of a ghost in the console's release schedule. But then, nestled at the bottom, we get a glimpse of Top Gear Rally by Boss Game Studios, the true beacon of light in this off-road desert. You can practically hear the collective sigh of relief in the write-up. It actually looks the part. While the rest of us were perfectly content drifting endlessly around the rainbow-colored corners of Mario Kart 64, Top Gear Rally offered something that looked like it possessed a serious suspension system and lighting effects that weren't just slapped on for show. It was one of the few games where the preview actually managed to make you think that the developers were building an environment that didn't just feel like a loop of corridors. It stood out because it promised complexity in an era of simplistic racing, even if we were still being fed the standard marketing lines about it being just around the corner. It was classic territory. Convince the player base they are on the cusp of a revolution, while praying the development team doesn't hit a wall of deadlines. Still, we ate it up, every last pixel of it. Next, we are presented with a fascinating look at the state of console sports simulations and the genuine, palpable excitement surrounding Nintendo's early experiments with their 2D and 3D tech. The writer's apprehension toward the football titles is practically oozing off the page, and honestly, who could blame them? EA Sports during that era was, let's say, inconsistent. Following their critically roasted efforts on the PlayStation, seeing FIFA 64 pitched as the savior of the living room kickabout was met with the kind of squinty-eyed suspicion usually reserved for a used car salesman. That jibe about the anorexic PlayStation version really hits the nail on the head regarding the console war rhetoric of the day. Everyone was just desperate for something that didn't feel like moving players through quicksand, though let's be real, most of us were holding out hope for International Superstar Soccer 64 to truly school everyone else on the pitch, even if we were too polite to say so in these early previews. Then, there's that fascinating sidebar on Creation, the proposed Mario Paint title for the 64DD. That add-on is essentially the holy grail of forgotten 64 hardware, a mystical, perpetually over-the-horizon device that fueled countless playground arguments about whether it would actually release outside of Japan. Seeing it touted in print reminds you how we were essentially suckers for the idea of expansion packs before we ever truly understood the reality of the business model. Moving to the other page, the discussion around Yoshi's Island 64, which we now know as Yoshi's Story, is genuinely captivating because of its absolute earnestness. At the time, magazines were clutching these pearls of previews like they were blueprints for the future. The sheer awe surrounding a storming epitaph to 2D gaming, handled by the great Miyamoto himself, reveals just how confused the industry was about where the console was headed. We were obsessed with that distinctive pre-rendered aesthetic, those chunky sprites on vibrant backdrops, even if the eventual release of that title left more than a few gamers scratching their heads at its rather short, breezy gameplay loop. Finally, glancing at San Francisco Rush among the rest of the previews, it serves as a sobering reminder of why we approached arcade ports with the trepidation of a cat entering a bath. After the absolutely tragic attempt at bringing Cruisin' USA to our televisions, the industry had a monumental task in winning us back. There was this perpetual hope bordering on denial that maybe, just maybe, This next port would capture that neon arcade-blasting adrenaline without feeling like it was chugging through the hardware's limitations. We bought the magazines for the hype, lived for the glossy screenshots, and prayed that the final product wouldn't stutter the moment we touched a wall. The next page plunges headfirst into that weird, feverish period of development where the industry was collectively questioning if polygons were the be-all and end-all of gaming. It's a treat to see the magazine shifting its gaze toward treasures go troublemakers. Honestly, back in those days, seeing the developer of Gunstar Heroes step up to the plate meant one thing. You paid attention. While everyone else was scrambling to figure out how to stop 3D models from looking like jagged heaps of triangles, Treasure just stuck their nose up at the lot of them and focused on tight, explosive, pre-rendered 2D mechanics. The anticipation was genuinely palpable. There was a sense of comfort in knowing someone still knew how to build a sprite-based world that wouldn't crumble when the camera moved an inch. Watching Marina tossing those gumballs around in print, it looked leagues cleaner than most of the blocky messes passing for platformers at the time. Then, we have the bizarre pivot to air combat and strange experimentations. The previews for Sonic Wings Assault and Wild Choppers perfectly encapsulate the desperate need for varied genres on a system still starving for quality titles. You get that creeping sense of trepidation from the writers, particularly with Wild Choppers, dropping a polite reminder about how poorly the same developer's golf title was received, is the kind of professional, passive-aggressive slap that made reading these previews so much fun. It was code for, "Don't mess this up, or we will not be kind to you next time." It's hard not to wince looking back. How many helicopter simulators actually nailed it on a console? Almost none, yet here we were, perpetually hoping this would be the one that didn't fly like a wet paper bag. Then there's the preview for Silicon Valley, later known as Body Harvest. If you don't recall this being discussed with a mixture of bewilderment and curiosity, you likely weren't reading enough magazines. The whole concept of hopping into different animal forms just to handle an alien invasion sounded almost too dense for its own good. A classic symptom of early N64 ambition outpacing actual console logic. Drama Design clearly had ideas larger than the hardware's capabilities, but that didn't stop us from wanting it to be brilliant. And finally, tucked away, is Blade and Barrel. Linking it to the intensity of Turok, the holy grail of visual spectacle, during that specific era, was a cheap, yet incredibly effective trick to pique any reader's interest. Promoting it as an industrial, four-player shooter with enough weaponry to level a small country, you could almost hear the hypothetical pre-teen arguments about controller ports firing up in the reader's imagination. Whether it delivered or not is irrelevant. For one glorious page in 1997, it was the explosive multiplayer dream everyone suddenly thought they needed. The next page pulls us into the murky, desperate optimism of 1997, a time when any title that dared to render a moving polygon was met with bated breath and unrealistic expectations. It's a quaint little time capsule of pure, unfiltered naivety. We start with Gametech's Robotech, Crystal Dreams, a title so bloated with promises of total interactivity and shape-shifting drama that you'd think it was destined to change the world. It's hilarious reading these breathless previews today, knowing that this title was effectively the industry's poster child for development hell, destined to vanish entirely before it could ever hit our cartridge slots. We really fell for it hook, line, and sinker, didn't we? Imagine believing that Gametech would manage to seamlessly pull off Veritech transformations while maintaining a frame rate above slideshow speed. It was the absolute height of optimism, but that was the game. We wanted that dream to be real, even if our better judgment should have been screaming for us to run in the opposite direction. Then we spiral into that weird, repetitive black hole of the 3D fighting genre. Developers seemingly woke up, looked at the N64 and thought, yes, exactly what we need are 10 more clunky, awkward brawlers with camera angles from the 9th circle of hell. First up, Dark Rift. They touted it as nifty, citing its speed and fancy projectiles as the new benchmark. Let's be honest, in hindsight, these fighters were rarely the high-octane spectacles the PR machine made them out to be. It's almost sweet how the writers fawned over its supposed quality. Then there's Dual Heroes, the Hudson Soft contender that thought channeling a low-budget Power Rangers aesthetic was the key to unlocking the market. Watching these games try to justify their existence in a format where we barely knew how to move in 3D is peak 1997. They pushed the three-dimensional fighter angle with such forced confidence that you almost want to reach back in time and hand the developers a tissue to wipe the sweat from their brows. Everyone was scrambling, praying that one of these mid-tier efforts would stick, even when it was blatantly obvious they were just placeholder junk filling space on the shelf while we waited for something, anything, to genuinely deliver on the console's potential. Regarding the massive page on the right, an over-the-top, moralizing full-page advertisement for Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, guilt-tripping the reader for Pixel Massacre while showcasing the pure, unfiltered joy of unloading an M16 on prehistoric lizards. This page presents the sheer, raw desperation of 1997, a time where N64 owners were practically clawing at the curtains, begging for anything involving experience points and coherent dialogue. You would think the N64 was deathly allergic to the role-playing genre. It is hilariously transparent how they frame the narrative here. The writer is practically holding the reader by the collar, shaking them, and screaming that RPGs are coming, all while trying to mask the stinging truth that industry giants like Square and Enix had no interest in playing ball. It is a tragic dance of optimism. Then we hit Mother 3. Or as we rightfully recognize it today, the most infuriating vaporware of the era. They are rambling on about the 64DD, that ill-fated hardware expansion that became a punchline almost as fast as it was announced. The preview treats this 3D transition like the second coming of the Messiah. Seeing those low-poly blocky models of Sunis and his friends is just heartbreaking with the benefit of hindsight. The article earnestly discusses a Western release for Mother 3, and the level of naivety on display is almost touching. Little did the writer know that the Nintendo magic required to actually manifest that game in the West would take well over a decade, and an entirely different handheld console to finally settle. And what's this? Crystal Stories, better known to those who unfortunately experienced the retail version as the excruciatingly bare-bones Quest 64. The audacity to call those early textures stunning is incredible. Someone at the publication was clearly writing on an empty stomach, because let's be fair, describing those sterile, lonely fields as anything other than a profound exercise in boredom is a crime against standards. They promise deep, ethereal gameplay with spirit handlers. We received a wizard who moves at the speed of a tranquilized sloth, and a world so empty, it felt like a tech demo that had taken a wrong turn and ended up on a cartridge. Move your eyes over to the mission, impossible feature. It is deeply amusing to see them hold it up as a competitor to the absolute titan that was GoldenEye. At the time, Ocean Software really thought they were revolutionizing stealth. Reading that they thought the enemy AI was stunning is a comedic peak for this entire issue. It's easy to feel like a visionary when your competition is thin on the ground, but in reality, Mission Impossible ended up being more about memorizing predictable movement loops than genuine espionage brilliance. Finally, that sidebar regarding Midway's output, the talk of Doom, Robotron and Mortal Kombat ports, reads like a desperate plea for legitimacy. It's akin to watching a panicked salesperson trying to distract you with low-quality filler, just to prevent you from walking out the door. The inclusion of F-Zero and Kirby's Air Ride in the coming soon lists is a proper flashback, reminding us of the years we spent hovering over those specific titles as they teased us from the horizon, rarely appearing when we actually wanted them to. We wanted legendary titles. Half the time they handed us mediocre ports and prayed we wouldn't count the gaps on the shelf. The next page is a sprawling testament to the endurance required in 1997. It's an alphabetized graveyard of TBA statuses and broken promises. Scanning this, you get the distinct chill of realizing GoldenEye and Zelda 64. The future titans were mere specks on a distant horizon. It's laughable to see Mother 3 listed with such misplaced confidence, given the agonizing, decade-long comedy of errors that unfolded for its eventual release. This isn't just a table. It's a manual for cultivating chronic impatience, while waiting for the good stuff to finally escape development hell. Next we have the N64 Arena, a section that acts less like a simple review page, and more like a gladiatorial combat pit, where every title has to prove it's not just tech demo garbage before being graced with a recommendation. In the fresh dawn of April 1997, these reviews carried significant weight. Look at that Super Mario 64 highlight. It wasn't just a review, it was the absolute baseline for reality. If your platformer wasn't that tight, you might as well bin the disc. The editors didn't hold back, demanding full completion and absolute mastery before slapping a seal of approval on anything. It's refreshingly arrogant, frankly. That Guide to Scoring panel tells you everything you need to know about their philosophy. Only the elite games, the true star game award winners, deserved your hard-earned cash. They viewed poor software as a personal insult, and that abrasive, gatekeeping attitude was exactly what we needed when every single Nintendo cartridge cost an arm and a leg. Consider the heavy hitters featured. You've got Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, which remains the quintessential example of turning that thick, encroaching hardware fog into a functional gameplay feature. It had weaponry that made your screen feel physically heavier, turning a simple raptor shootout into a grand, pixelated spectacle. Then Shadows of the Empire, an ambitious attempt to shove us right inside a Star Wars cockpit. It felt truly massive at the time, even if modern eyes might spot the occasional jagged polygon or awkward movement. And Pilotwings 64? It provided the perfect remedy for all that high-octane shoot-'em-up stress, capturing the gentle, floating thrill of flight so effectively that you'd swear your joystick was actually changing local air pressure. Then there's the Yongnezo Import Arena. Remember the absolute frenzy to track down NTSC titles just to shave months off a local UK release date? You'd spend weeks saving up, only to find yourself squinting at Japanese text, blindly guessing menu options in games like Mahjong Master or J-League Perfect Striker just to see the Nintendo logo in motion. It was absurd behavior, truly, but entirely necessary for anyone needing their Mario Kart 64 fix before the shop saw fit to grace our shores with stock. The grading system itself is the star, frankly. Visuals, sounds, mastery and lifespan, the precise metrics by which we lived and died. A score of 85% and above meant you weren't burning money, whereas dipping into those lower brackets felt like a tragedy. It kept the standard sky high, ensured the hype remained grounded, and most importantly, told us precisely which cartridges were worth fighting your brothers for. Welcome to the arena, where mediocre efforts are politely shredded, and the winners live forever on the top shelf. The next page isn't just an advertorial, it's practically a coronation. You open this spread, and are immediately confronted with a headline comparing a plumbing, dungaree-wearing mustachioed marvel to Julius Caesar. Whoever penned this copy was clearly pulling out all the stops, and while comparing a plumber to a Roman emperor is admittedly a bit theatrical, one can't deny that both had a penchant for conquering vast, new territories. The imagery is likely burned into the retinas of anyone who was inhabiting this planet in 1997. Mario caught mid-shout with a positively menacing Bowser looming in the background, huffing fire as if he's attempting to grill a snack the size of a small planet. This was the Norse Hasmenetin game. You likely spent months scouring imported gaming magazines, squinting at blurry, low-resolution screens of this world, wondering if a simple thumbstick could possibly navigate that kind of depth. And when the big day finally arrived, it brought with it that princely sum of £59.95. Yes, do read that again. Nearly 60 quid of hard-earned cash for a single game. You likely had to sell a kidney, convince your grandmother she needed a chorus loan for an early birthday gift, or take up multiple paper rounds just to get it. But remarkably, unlike a lot of overpriced software that promised the world and delivered a paperweight, you didn't feel swindled. Miyamoto's perfectionism is legendary, bordering on infuriating at the time really, with the constant grinding delays. The text here drops an Oscar Wilde quote about the difference between a game being finished and a great game, and while it's a bit highbrow for a publication largely dedicated to running through pipe systems, the sentiment lands. That delay was agonizing. You had kids desperate enough to hunt down Japanese NTSC versions, just so they didn't have to wait for the local PAL release. But when you finally jammed that grey and black cartridge home, and gripped that strange three-pronged controller, the wait simply vanished. Look at those screenshots featured at the bottom of the page. There's the Ghost House, which introduced a level of charm we'd never seen before, and that Bowser fight tossing him by the tail like a spinning top. It made every prior 3D experiment on competing systems look like a prototype sketched on a dinner napkin. This title finally gave the analog stick a proper reason to exist. It taught you physics, momentum, and the brutal reality of what happens when you leap toward a star you can't quite reach. This wasn't just another addition to the library, it was the entire industry hitting the reset button. Every game that followed, everything from sprawling adventures to frantic racing titles, immediately had to figure out how to navigate 3 dimensions without inducing motion sickness or feeling like you were steering a barge. You see that clearly now, decades later, but in the thick of it, it was just technical wizardry. The editors didn't even need to write a full review to convince you. They knew that regardless of the bank-breaking cost, this was essential equipment. It was the only way to play, and for once in this hobby, the reality was actually better than the hype. The next page feels less like a standard guide, and more like a necessary remedial course in spatial awareness for a species that, up until that point, was used to moving strictly left to right. We were all absolute beginners again, weren't we? After years of holding B to sprint and hammering A to jump, here we were staring at an analog stick, staring down a slope on Bobo MB Battlefield, trying not to look like an utter amateur. This spread tackles the most essential, yet initially maddening, component of the console's crown jewel, the camera system. Those screenshots highlighting the key to cam are actually quite funny when you realize that in 1997, you essentially had to perform amateur cinematography while trying to avoid falling into a bottomless chasm. That little cameraman on a cloud, your one-man production crew, was the thin line between a calculated precision jump and a frantic flailing plunge to your doom. Mastering those yellow C buttons was the real rite of passage for every new owner. You didn't just play Mario 64, you effectively directed the footage of your own eventual humiliation. Then there's the bread and butter of the first level described here. Throwing the Bomb King, scuttling up the hill, discovering those convenient walk points near the summit. It's deep tissue muscle memory now, but you remember the struggle, don't you? It felt revolutionary to actually walk behind an enemy, grab them, and just heave them aside. The game treated the level not as a corridor, but as a sandbox. And let's be honest, who didn't spend far too much time playing Shell Surf, just for the sheer adrenaline hit of zipping across the grass? There was a frantic quality to it, mostly because the camera would inevitably wig out the second you gained real speed. Using the Z trigger to ditch the shell right before a cliff edge became that weird, specific skill you probably felt entirely too smug about mastering. The magazine is being brutally practical because it knew that without these pointers, we'd have spent our Saturday mornings running in circles. There was no point in having the most sophisticated piece of silicon in your bedroom if you didn't have the foggiest idea how to move properly within it. Even the advice about the bomb baiting, stunts, is charmingly innocent. It's basically telling us to wind the enemy up just for the fun of it, which was peak 90s gaming. Finding actual entertainment in the physics of the game, rather than just hitting a switch to complete a mission. We were collectively learning a new language here, one written in 3D coordinates, and every fail recorded by our floating cameraman was just tuition in the University of Platforming. It's easy to look back at these tiny grainier shots now and chuckle, but at the time, that tip about adjusting your viewing angle wasn't just advice, it was the secret code to unlocking the kingdom. The next page drops us directly into the stony, looming shadows of Hump's Fortress, which serves as a stark reminder that Nintendo didn't waste any time escalating the difficulty. If the opening level was a gentle hand-holding session into 3D navigation, Hump's Fortress was the equivalent of being thrown into the deep end without water wings. We're moving from rolling fields to vertical, cliff-hanging death traps, where the masonry itself has a grudge. The magazine's guide is perfectly sensible, focusing on the sheer tactical importance of turning an enemy's predictable attack against them. The humps, those walking, shouting stone slabs, are still iconic, aren't they? There's a certain grim satisfaction in baiting one to faceplant, and then casually strolling over its back to collect the spoils. It sounds trivial, but at the time, getting that combat loop down running up, feinting and timing that pound perfectly, was the definition of getting good. If you mistimed it, you didn't just take damage, you were flattened into a pancake by the wall itself. There's also a rather essential lesson buried in these tips regarding the wing cap. To any modern player who grew up with refined control sticks and stable flight mechanics, watching a player grapple with Mario's 90s-era flight controls might seem like a tragic comedy. It wasn't about taking off, it was about maintaining aerodynamic integrity while trying to prevent a pixelated plumber from nosediving into the abyss. The article treats the analog stick with the reverence of an aircraft manual, which was absolutely necessary. You had to have a delicate thumb to truly soar, otherwise you were just a flying lawn dart plummeting toward a, shall we say, premature restart. I appreciate how these snippets highlight the importance of the magazine's way of quantifying the impending frustration. It was a clear warning system. Do not attempt to look like a hero unless you have mastered the jump-to-fall ratio. You see the advice regarding the sliding tiles and falling hazards? It's blunt. They knew we were prone to taking the fast route to death just to save 3 seconds. The most impressive takeaway here is the focus on spatial verticality. This was the era where falling off the edge of the world stopped being an artistic choice and became a constant looming threat. You weren't just running, you were managing risk with every single step. This guide essentially acted as our safety training for the 3D generation. We weren't just playing, we were pioneering a new way to occupy space in a digital world. It feels quite quaint now to see such serious breakdown of these mechanics, but at the time, reading this felt like deciphering the forbidden scriptures for success. You didn't just read it, you memorized the tactics to avoid looking like an amateur in front of your mates. The next double-page spread plunges us, quite literally, into the drink with Jolly Roger Bay. We've successfully swapped the frantic, stone-stomping misery of the previous level for the arguably more stressful experience of aquatic hypoxia. Does anyone actually forget that sinking feeling when your health meter ticked down and you were desperately searching for a coin, or, heaven forbid, a single, tantalizing bubble? It was a far more elegant way to perish than being flattened into a pancake by a slab of masonry, but no less frustrating. This feature doesn't mince words regarding the control scheme. The magazine rightfully highlights the steep learning curve required for navigating three-dimensional fluid dynamics. Let's be honest, back in 1997, steering Mario underwater felt somewhat like driving a shopping trolley through molasses with a flight stick. You were either hurtling into jagged cavern walls with zero grace, or hovering in the middle of the abyss like a confused guppy. The guide's advice regarding holding down the B button to initiate a gentle, rhythmic swim versus panicked button mashing was basically the only thing standing between the average player and a game over screen. Get that rhythm wrong, and you were fish food. The write-up delves into the nuances of the sunken ship, which remains a seminal gaming moment to this day. Seeing that pirate vessel groan and rise out of the bay floor once the water drained. It felt like genuine sorcery. It wasn't just a gimmick. It gave you that rare, potent feeling that your actions actually altered the physical state of the world. The guide tries to streamline the process for us, specifically warning against the fool's errand of opening those treasure chests in the incorrect sequence. Attempt the puzzle out of order, and you are greeted by an electric jolt, punishing your hubris with a bit of, shall we say, electrifying feedback. It's a classic Nintendo trope, giving the player just enough freedom to hang themselves. The technical tips regarding pole manipulation and cannon usage are suitably utilitarian. While accurate, the real unspoken lesson of Jolly Roger Bay wasn't about button inputs. It was about maintaining your composure. The environment itself was a hungry predator, waiting for you to get complacent. Watching that health meter shrink while you frantically hunted for an air pocket was the quintessential experience of this era. It was challenging, occasionally obtuse, but undeniably rewarding. You weren't just playing a level. You were holding your own breath alongside the plumber, desperately praying that your analog stick didn't twitch and send you nosediving into a drowning hazard. It was, quite simply, Nintendo at its best, making the basic act of breathing feel like a high-stakes adventure. The next page is a glorious double-header of frozen peril, and the kind of high-stakes platforming that made 1997 feel like a pivotal year for digital existence. We transition from the damp, suffocating misery of the last zone directly into the frigid slopes of Cool Mountain. Let's be frank. The sheer friction coefficient of these icy surfaces remains one of the defining trials of the N64 era. While the guide makes a noble attempt to provide some semblance of order with their tips on corner cutting and trajectory management, we all know the reality of the situation. You were always one stray analog twitch away from skating uncontrollably off the edge of a cliff to a chilly death. The article rightfully harps on the absurdity of the penguin rescue mission. There was something uniquely frustrating about forcing us to adopt a role as a high-speed, 3D babysitter. Trying to navigate that mountain path whilst gingerly clutching the shivering, beaked offspring, terrified of letting gravity take hold, felt less like a platforming challenge and more like a lesson in extreme manual dexterity. The magazine calls it cute, but to any veteran plumber, it was a gauntlet of anxiety. And let's spare a thought for the level designers who thought a cannon tucked away at the top of a peak was the height of logical navigation. We spent enough hours eyeballing those crosshairs to qualify as artillery experts, praying the transition from cannon to icy landing didn't send us pinballing into oblivion. Flipping over to the right side of the spread, the mood shifts from icy alpine frustration to the ominous, checkerboard gloom of the first Dark World. This was the moment the training wheels really detached. Stepping into that enclosed, suspended arena for a cage match with Bowser was, and remains, an essential piece of video game history. The guide captures the tension of the era beautifully, noting the sheer man-to-man intensity of the encounter. It wasn't a standard, jump on his head 3 times, routine. This required actual tactical movement, exploiting the geometry of the arena, and grappling with physics. Watching Mario physically swing the King of Koopas around by the tail felt monumental. It gave the player agency in a way that the side-scrolling precursors simply never could. Even with the slightly wonky camera occasionally throwing a fit in the corner of the room, successfully planting Bowser onto a spiky bomb was, frankly, a euphoric hit of accomplishment. The magazine's inclusion of a fleeting Dennis Hopper reference poking fun at that utterly bizarre 93 film shows just how desperate the media was to link Nintendo's brand new, high-concept world with existing, perhaps less prestigious, pop culture. We can laugh at the comparison now, but it underscores that sense of, whoa, the gaming press was feeling. This wasn't just a console, it was the birth of an entire language of interaction. Whether you were careening down a slide or hucking Bowser into the void, it was clear we weren't just playing games anymore. We were wrestling with a new reality, one polygon and one slippery, slidey penguin at a time. The next page brings us to the wardrobe essential of 1997. The hats that essentially transformed Mario from a basic plumber with a vertical leap into something akin to a polygon-based superhero. It's hard to overstate the shift this game forced on our brains. In the past, a power-up might give you a fireball or make you larger. Here, it gave you agency. It gave you dominion over the third dimension. These power-up courses weren't just extra levels, they were our advanced training in spatial navigation, movement physics, and the sheer audacity of being able to phase through a stone wall because you happened to be wearing the right accessory. The wing cap, our gateway into the sky, was and remains a beautiful exercise in clumsy aviation. While the text here helpfully tries to compare it to the lofty heights of Pilotwings 64, we all knew the reality. You were a rotund man in a cap flailing blindly, desperately banking into coin formations while hoping you didn't clip an invisible wall and nosedive. The red box design was distinct, a visual beacon that promised a break from the standard jump and stomp grind. Mastering the aerial approach, lining yourself up for that flight path. It was the first time we genuinely felt the scope of Nintendo's design ambitions. Then we descend into the damp absurdity of the metal and vanish caps. The metal cap was the highlight for the inner teenager in us all. That Terminator-esque aesthetic wasn't just cool, it made you functionally invincible to drowning and pressure, which changed how you looked at every watery hazard in the castle. It forced us to think in terms of environmental resistance rather than just health meters. The green switch course was hidden away in that hazy maze area, demanding a level of exploration that wasn't immediately obvious, serving as a reward for the persistent and the curious. The vanish cap, locked away behind the draining of the moat, was arguably the most inventive mechanic in the entire kit. The idea that a power-up could negate collision detection for specific surfaces was genuinely mind-bending for a player base conditioned by 2D limitations. Using it felt less like playing a game and more like you were breaking into restricted areas. What's hilarious reading this today is the tone of the helpful guide. It speaks as if you'll simply saunter in and activate these switches with professional composure. We know better. The camera in this era was our most persistent, malicious adversary, and navigating these challenges meant fighting both the platforming physics and the viewfinder itself. The sidebar's musing on the Shy Guys being strategically suspicious is typical 1997 game journalism, taking rudimentary enemy pathing and spinning it into deep psychological warfare. Let's be real. They were just annoying, waddling hurdles that occasionally ganged up on you. But God help you if you let your guard down near those ledges. These pages essentially mapped out our transition from 2D linear thinking into the, sometimes frustrating, world of total three-dimensional movement. Next we have the concluding rites of this Super Mario 64 manifesto, where the magazine pauses to consider the finer, dare I say, spiritual points of our collective obsession. The writing here really tries to dissect why this title managed to redefine our expectations so completely, looking past the basic, run and jump, mechanics, and into the design philosophy that changed the trajectory of the medium. They spend a fair bit of ink eulogizing Koji Kondo's score, and frankly they're right to be starry-eyed. We'd spent years tolerating synthesized bleeps that cycled endlessly on an 8-second loop. Suddenly we're treated to orchestrations that actually morph as you dart from sun-drenched beaches to damp, cavernous depths. The magazine highlights the Ghost House audio shifts with good reason. Back in 1997, it felt borderline voodoo to hear the track dampen and intensify based on your proximity to the haunts. It was proper atmosphere, effectively elevating the plumber from a flat sprite to a legitimate resident of a living world. The piece describes the game as a playground, and while that sounds like standard marketing fluff today, it hits the nail on the head regarding the shift in our mental approach. It wasn't about the singular goal of survival or navigating a 2D horizontal deathmarch anymore. It was about the kinetic joy of chaining backflips and diving headlong into portraits. The reviewers acknowledge how effortlessly players would abandon their objective just to test the limits of the engine on a slide, which was exactly how it felt. They're surprisingly honest about the pop-up, those jarring environmental assets appearing from nowhere. Frame it not as a failure, but as a quirk that you eventually forgive because the sheer scale is so staggering. Now looking at the spoiler block, this perfectly captures the uniquely stressful pre-internet era of 1997. They touch upon the friction between the Japanese launch and our Western version, specifically the scrubbing of text-heavy guidance. It's written with that distinct stiff upper lip approach. Figure it out for yourself, son. For those of us fumbling through the castle, struggling without the benefit of Japanese strategy guides or quick web searches, it was truly a trial by fire, or rather, trial by lava pit. The writer insists that the lack of hand-holding actually made the eventual mastery of 120 stars feel like you'd earned a degree in navigation. They're spot on. It felt rewarding precisely because it didn't feel cheap. That final, gleaming 96% score, it wasn't hyperbole. It was the definitive stake in the ground for the N64. There's no point pretending we weren't spoiled by the arrival of this cartridge. It wasn't just a platformer, it was a technical manifesto, and while it had the rough edges you'd expect from a pioneer, it effectively silenced every critic in the industry who thought we were stuck with simple side-scrollers. Everything that came before suddenly felt like yesterday's news. This page abruptly yanks us from the polished, vibrant perfection of Mario's world and tosses us into the freezing, jagged landscape of Hoth. Back in 1997, Shadows of the Empire was essentially the required purchase for any new N64 owner. We all collectively decided it was incredible, mostly because we were starving for anything featuring X-Wings and AT-ATS. It was the only Star Wars experience we had that didn't involve rewinding a VHS tape. The editorial consensus here correctly highlights that the first level is essentially the entire reason the game survived in the public consciousness. Flying the snowspeeder was, quite frankly, glorious. Taking down an AT-AT with that towing cable timing the turns, managing the speed that was a visceral, adrenaline-fueled thrill that actually lived up to the movie-inspired expectations. The magazine's reviewers seem quite taken by the visuals, and they aren't wrong. The sense of scale in that level was legitimately impressive. But then, as if the developer suddenly lost their grip on reality, we have the subsequent ground missions. The shift to third-person action for Escape from Echo Base was, and remains, an absolute clunker of a design choice. Let's be brutally honest. Dash Rendar moves like a fridge strapped to a skateboard. The magazine quite politely describes it as unrealistic animation, which is code for saying the controls are a bit of a pig's breakfast. The reviewers' point about the Doom-style camera angle making things needlessly difficult is spot on. If you ever found yourself wrestling with the targeting reticle while Dash ran face-first into a wall because of the clunky perspective, you were far from alone. Then we have this peculiar Yodometer rating system, which remains one of the more questionable relics of 90s gaming journalism. The idea of slapping a score of 5 on the second level just makes you laugh, doesn't it? It feels slightly arbitrary, though it does succinctly capture that sinking feeling of transitioning from the stellar dogfights to the middling third-person corridor trudging. You can sense the magazine's struggle here. They're trying to remain optimistic about the package as a whole, because frankly it was Star Wars and it was 1997, so we were programmed to overlook the warts. But reading between the lines of these tips, you see the admissions of how unforgiving the game could be, suggesting we stick to hard mode, because the only real challenge is finding the collectibles. It feels like they were desperately looking for depth, where there wasn't much to find. Still, despite the wonky controls and the questionable level design, the ambition was visible. It's a curate's egg of a title, a masterpiece of pilot sim mechanics grafted onto a very creaky, dated action platformer. One can't help but look back and smile at how high our hopes were, despite the obvious limitations under the hood. The next page continues this erratic journey through the uneven, jagged landscape of Shadows of the Empire. The editorial tone remains consistent in its struggle to balance genuine affection for the Star Wars license against the technical shortcomings that seem to haunt every ground-based encounter in the game. It is a classic example of 90s-era design philosophy. When in doubt, just add more collectibles and force the player to retread the same awkward ground until they feel they have extracted some value from the experience. Looking at the level breakdowns, one cannot help but notice the bizarre disparity in the so-called Yoda scores. The game oscillates between being a manageable romp and an absolute test of patience. The Ghoul spaceport, with its focus on jetpack maneuverability, serves as an interesting experiment. Jetpacks are inherently cool, though in execution here, it felt as though Dash was tethered to a particularly stubborn piece of elastic. We all vividly recall how managing fuel consumption, whilst dodging rotating ventilation fans and pot-shotting probe droids, made for a stressful affair. Yet, there is a charming audacity to the developers forcing these mechanics upon us. You see, this was 1997. We did not demand perfection in controls, we just demanded a playable space where we could roleplay as our favorite heroes. Then there are the sewers of the Imperial City. This particular stage highlights the persistent issue of underground levels in the N64 era. Too much murk, not enough clarity, and a camera that fought against the player at every turn. That Dianoga boss encounter remains a distinct memory of pure frustration. It was a lesson in how not to handle underwater boss battles, with the player fighting more against the targeting reticle than the actual monster. Still, the magazine guides us through this with that peculiar detached enthusiasm. Switching gears, we reach the asteroid field and Ord-Mantle junkyard. If there is one truth in Shadows of the Empire, it is that the flight mechanics are what kept this cartridge from being relegated to the bottom of the toy box. Flying through space to intercept TIE fighters and dodging rocky obstacles felt leagues better than navigating corridors. The reviewer correctly identifies the sheer monotony of searching for hidden points in the junkyard, which frankly, sounds like a tedious exercise in tedium for the sake of completeness. Comparing a train mission to a Doom-style encounter feels like a bit of a reach. Usually, Doom had a certain flow to the violence, whereas moving trains in Shadows served mostly to highlight how dangerously close Dash walked to the edge of the world. Yet the consensus among players back then remained locked in. We overlooked the sluggish movement and the awkward combat because we wanted nothing more than to fly an X-Wing, even if it meant tolerating the baggage that came with it. It was the best kind of compromise, provided you had the patience of a saint. This next spread continues our bewildering trajectory through the jagged, often stubborn world of Shadows of the Empire. The editorial tone maintains a polite but weary distance, perfectly mirroring the experience of every kid in 1997 who desperately wanted this game to be a flawless space simulator, but found themselves grappling with controls that were often about as intuitive as flying through an asteroid field with one eye closed. We find ourselves charting levels 5, 6, 7, and jumping straight to the Skyhook finale at level 10. It's truly a testament to that bygone era of gaming, where developers seem to have a roulette wheel for mechanics, spin it, and see what you land on today. Level 5, Xiz's Palace, forces us back into the jetpack suit. While jetpacks look brilliant on paper, the in-game execution usually felt like dragging a toddler on a lead, with precision being an afterthought. You have to hand it to them for trying, but these bits served as a stern reminder that verticality was still something of a work in progress for the industry at the time. Then we hit level 6, Mos Eisley and Beggar's Canyon. Even in the pages of an official magazine there is no sugarcoating this. The reviewer describes it as terribly handled, and you can practically hear the collective sigh of relief when you manage to finish it without careening into a wall at max speed. Those speeder bikes were less of a thrill ride and more of an accidental exercise in endurance. Killing speeders, or failing spectacularly while dodging canyon walls, was the specific flavor of misery that defined this stage. Level 7 brings us into the belly of the beast, the Imperial Freighter. This is where the game tries its hand at a standard run-and-gun corridor shooter. It's remarkably Doom style, which is the obligatory 1997 way of saying, look, we made the textures grey and placed enemies behind crates. It is utilitarian, efficient, and thoroughly uninspired compared to the flight segments, but at least the loader droid boss offers a challenge that requires more brainpower than simply aiming in a general direction. Finally, we arrive at the level 10 Skyhook battle, the supposed pinnacle. Here, the magazine hits the nail on the head. Space combat is where this cartridge actually thrives. Dodging TIE fighters and dancing around the station turrets is vastly more fluid than watching poor Dash Rendar struggle to walk down a corridor. This is exactly what the license deserves: space combat that actually makes you feel like an ace pilot rather than a space trucker driving into oncoming traffic. It is worth sparing a thought for that N64's patented yodometer. The very idea of slapping a Jedi-themed thermometer onto the side of a game guide to rank your level progress is just the sort of bizarre, imaginative nonsense that we absolutely lived for in early issues. The final verdict? A 78%. It is essentially the textbook definition of a solid launch title, with visuals that held up just well enough, and sound effects that successfully bypassed the brain's criticism centers to strike directly at the heart of our adoration for Star Wars. It was the best you could get for the N64's early days. It wasn't the polish and brilliance we'd later demand, but it filled the void while we waited for something truly legendary to hit the system. This page pulls us away from the heavy-duty blaster fire and awkward space trucking of our previous exploits to give us a stiff breeze and the crushing, meticulous weight of simulated gravity. We have landed squarely on Pilotwings 64, a title that, back in the fledgling days of 1997, wasn't just a game, it was an arrogant, bare-chested flexing of Nintendo's new silicon muscles. Let's address the elephant in the room. Pilotwings 64 wasn't exactly high-octane entertainment. While we were all desperate to launch into worlds, this game insisted that we take a breath and respect the aeronautics. The feature here spends an uncomfortable amount of time talking about thermals, and how one must manage the delicate ascent of a hang glider. It makes the experience sound like a glorious study in aeronautical engineering, with all that chatter about hunting for invisible patches of rising warm air. In practice, of course, it mostly felt like you were attempting to pilot a piece of sheet metal through a mildly drafty living room. It was walking on air, all right, but primarily the kind that came with the fear of being docked points for an off-center touchdown. The reviewer, quite rightly, notes that this title serves as a perfect counterpart to the more active genres we expected. Where Mario demanded jumps and combat, Pilotwings demanded that you stop, calm your nerves, and execute a perfect flare before hitting the ground. It was the quintessential paradox of the era, a launch title that insisted you respect the cold, hard laws of physics, right when all we really wanted to do was run headlong into explosions. Watching the perspective shift as you homed in on those landing pads, hoping you wouldn't slide off the edge into a heap of early 3D disappointment, was essentially high-fidelity living for 1997. If you landed anywhere but the absolute dead center, you might as well have just restarted. The machine had no time for incompetence. Then we have the cast of characters, or as the text brilliantly dubs them, spindly little airborne freaks. It's an accurate assessment. They inhabit that specific weird uncanny valley that developers loved back then, all weird proportions, giant hands, and wide-eyed expressionless stares. We all had our preference for who to pick, maybe selecting Goose because you liked his color scheme or Hawk just for the aesthetic. But ultimately, it didn't really matter, did it? They were all just test pilots, strapped into bizarre vehicles. Watching them animate stiff, jerky yet oddly charming is a visual timestamp we can't unsee. This page effectively captures the headspace we occupied when the console was still shiny and new. It was a test of the hardware's capability, a sandbox of potential that served as a serene palate cleanser between the intensity of other titles. It's methodical, it's pedantic, and frankly it is deeply irritating when you clip the wrong thermal and drift off target, but there is no denying its technical impact. It forced us to slow down, pay attention, and become better virtual pilots. Not the action hero fantasy we were sold on the box, but a bizarre, fascinating little gem that managed to find its own way of becoming an essential part of the collection. The next page effectively functions as a survival guide for those of us struggling to keep our airborne avatars from slamming into the scenery with embarrassing velocity. It presents a collection of tactical advice, treating the rocket belt and the gyrocopter not as pieces of janky 1997 code, but as serious aviation equipment. Reading this advice is genuinely funny with the benefit of hindsight. It speaks about steering the rocket belt with a sense of clinical precision, offering tips on how to avoid clipping mountain faces, as if anyone playing back then was gracefully dancing through the air. The reality, as we all recall, was holding the Z trigger like it was a lifeline, vibrating with anxiety while desperately twitching the analog stick, only to plummet into a ravine the second the wind shifted. It claims the gyrocopter is simply simplicity itself, which is perhaps the most audacious lie to be printed in a gaming magazine of that era. Attempting to maneuver that floating lawnmower, let alone hitting targets while your fingers screamed in agony from being forced to constantly hold down a button, was less about flying and more about wrestling with a system that fought you every millisecond of the way. Below the technical advice we find island hopping, an overview of the environments we were supposed to be masterfully conquering. Little States remains the most baffling entry, serving up that weird, fever dream version of the USA, where the Statue of Liberty keeps company with Mount Rushmore in a weirdly concentrated, tiny sandbox. It represents that specific era of N64 development. The bold, sometimes bizarre decision to pack varied, disparate icons into a single level simply because the hardware technically allowed it to happen. It was clunky, it was jarring, and yet, there was something undeniable about it. Crescent Island and the other destinations promised a level of visual freedom that we weren't used to. The magazine clearly tries to sell these islands as tranquil destinations for our daring exploits, painting a picture of serenity. Of course, this completely ignores the fact that we spent 90% of our time trying to find the landing pads, panicking because the, let's face it, somewhat aggressive physics engine didn't particularly care for our pilot skills. This page serves as a necessary intervention for the average player. Without these breadcrumbs of advice, most of us would have likely spent the entire spring of '97 crashing into the ocean or staring at the mission-failed screen. It encapsulates the frustration of being a 1997 early adopter. We were handed a beautiful, expansive toy that expected nothing less than surgical precision from thumbs that hadn't yet been trained for the precision of the new analog era. It's an informative spread, yes, but looking back it really just underscores how desperate the developer was to convince us that flying in a digital void could be an exhilarating weekend hobby rather than an endurance test. The next page pulls back the curtain on the secrets of Pilotwings 64, framed with the kind of earnest, straight-faced professionalism usually reserved for flight deck manuals. It attempts to guide us through the human cannonball, the jumble hopper, and that avian simulation that had us flapping our analog sticks as if that somehow generated lift in the real world. It's essentially a blueprint for how to manipulate the laws of physics on an N64 controller without ending up a crater in the mountain. The advice regarding the human cannonball level, specifically adjusting your aim by precise degrees to slap a bullseye on the face of Mount Rushmore, is a perfect encapsulation of early console frustration. The writer makes it sound so elegant, a delicate exercise in geometry. We were essentially firing a tiny human projectile into a wall of rock, hoping against hope to stick the landing. They paint it as a challenge to be conquered with wit. In practice, it was largely about enduring the repetitive mission-failed screen, while you tried to find the sweet spot between too much power and face-planting. Then there's the jumble hopper. The magazine tries to convince us that bouncing around skyscraper rooftops is a sophisticated ballet. In reality, it was usually a frantic exercise in damage control. It's the hallmark of the N64's early years, convincing ourselves that mastering an awkward, slightly stiff control scheme was in fact an incredible skill. And of course, they dwell on the map design again. Pilotwings 64 felt the need to shrink the entire American landscape into a collection of tourist hotspots, creating a fever dream version of the USA. Seeing a miniaturized Statue of Liberty sitting casually in the water felt, at the time, like an immense triumph of 3D processing power. We were so easily satisfied by depth and perspective back then that we barely questioned the weird, desolate atmosphere of these places. It didn't matter that the levels were barren, they were 3D, and they had draw distance that put the pixelated past to shame. The accompanying stat block, gifting the game an 89% score, is typical of the era's hunger for technical perfection. High marks in visuals, mastery, and lifespan essentially broadcasted a single message. This game was mandatory, not because it was the most riotous fun you'd have, but because it served as an engineering manifesto for the console. It was the tech demo, masquerading as a retail release, a polished, groomed display of what could be achieved if you treated the hardware with respect. You weren't playing for excitement, you were playing for bragging rights, determined to show your mates that you could land a gyrocopter on a dime without snapping the gear, even if you never managed to pull it off twice in a row. It is a refined, stubborn piece of software that demanded your total submission to its physics, a polite reminder of how strict we expected games to be when they first introduced us to that third dimension. The next page drops us right into the primal, blood-soaked jungle with Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. We've moved swiftly on from the sterile, floating island precision of flight simulations to something far more visceral. This wasn't just another game. For many of us, this was the reason to finally start squinting through that distinctive, all-enveloping N64 fog. Seeing this T-Rex gaping at the reader across the spread really drove home the point that the console was desperately trying to outgrow its cuddly, mushroom-munching reputation. The write-up frames it as a bold, risky piece of maneuvering by Acclaim, and honestly they aren't wrong. Back in the day, playing as Turok felt remarkably weighty. That peculiar, period-typical description of the protagonist as the traveling Indian aside, a phrase that really anchors this piece in the mid-90s. The premise of scouring these vast prehistoric lands for the missing bits of the chronoceptor felt, at the time, like a colossal undertaking. The text paints it as a glorious, intelligent conquest, though anyone who spent an afternoon lost in those thicket-filled levels knows the reality involved a fair bit of mindless backtracking, and wondering why the ground kept clipping into the walls. Let's discuss the hardware, specifically the arsenal. The article rightly nods to the Techbo, the silent killer of choice. You weren't just target practicing, you were painting the digital floor in a way that Mario 64 certainly never allowed. While the review focuses on the excitement of the fantastic new blaster, let's acknowledge the enemies. The text suggests they don't just shamble, and frankly, they were terrifyingly efficient. They didn't possess the tactical nuance of a modern soldier, sure, but they had the frantic, unpredictable movement of a lizard trapped in a blender. It was messy, It was raw, and it was precisely the kind of arcade shooter energy we demanded. There's a painful little detail at the bottom, £69.95. Bloody hell, remember that entry fee? For that extortionate amount of money, we demanded complete satisfaction. The reviewer is clearly doing some heavy lifting here, justifying that steep investment by heaping praise on the sheer scope of the levels and the raw spectacle of early 3D combat. And looking at those screenshots, grainy, moody, and surprisingly dark, you can see why they gave it the benefit of the doubt. It promised the gritty intensity that PC gamers had been hogging with the likes of Doom and Quake, only now it was ours, sitting there in a charcoal grey box beneath the television. It's a glowing review that feels very much like a honeymoon period write-up. It overlooks the performance jitters and the labyrinthine level design. But that was the Mo of the era, we wanted to believe. You didn't buy Turok to explore the nuanced, cheerful depths of the N64 architecture. You bought it to see how many raptors you could turn into mints before your thumb joints finally gave up. The next page drags us further into the thickets of lost land, handing us what the publication insists is a tactical playbook, or as I prefer to call it, the Which Gun Goes Bang Bang Best Manual. Honestly, seeing a dedicated breakdown of the arsenal is peak 1997 magazine fluff. It's written with that desperate attempt to make the gameplay sound like a refined, high-stakes military exercise, rather than a frantic exercise in running backwards while firing blindly at giant reptiles. The commentary on the knife, described here with startling affection as a natural hand filler, tells you everything you need to know about the budget-conscious nature of early 3D development. If you weren't already out of ammo, you had no business playing footsie with a bipedal dinosaur, but they present it as some vital tool of the trade. The text gleefully references the scab-ridden foot soldiers, a perfect example of that grit-at-all-costs tone we absolutely swallowed hook, line and sinker back then. They really wanted us to feel like elite warriors, despite us usually stumbling around because of a stubborn controller stick and the distinct lack of a refined auto-aim feature. The bow and arrow section is the highlight here. Let's be real, that tech bow was the game's actual salvation. You don't play a game like Turok for the pistol, which this magazine correctly implies is basically just for tickling the enemies into temporary frustration. You play it for the heavy artillery. The author waxing poetic about blue plumes of flame and turning monsters into pincushions isn't just filler. It describes the singular dopamine hit of landing a perfect shot that the designers spent months tuning to feel just heavy enough to be satisfying. It was a beautiful polygonal carnage. And then there's the sidebar, Key to the Kingdom, detailing the chore that was finding keys to progress. Rereading this brings back that specific, low-level dread of wandering in circles, because you missed a barely perceivable key hidden in the brown-tinted soup of a swamp level. We spent hours doing that, convincing ourselves it was exploring or being thorough, when really, we were just testing the limits of our own patience. The magazine sells it as an intellectual conquest, a gate-locked challenge that demands mastery of the landscape. But really, it was just the only way they could extend the game's longevity. You didn't conquer these levels, you just suffered through them until the screen told you that you were finished. Still, the sheer, unbridled commitment to selling the spectacle remains impressive. Look at how they describe the assault rifle, talking about it as if it's an actual heavy-duty bit of hardware, not a cluster of jagged blocks spraying low-resolution projectiles at equally boxy enemies. You can almost feel the excitement radiating off the paper, the belief that we were witnessing the absolute future of gaming hardware, rather than an experimental console wrestling with draw distances and frame rate hiccups. It's easy to poke fun at the pros now, but the reality is that we read these pages like holy scripture. We wanted, perhaps needed, to believe that Turok was the ultimate evolution of the shooter, and the marketing machine behind it knew exactly how to keep that flame burning. The next page leans hard into the "why would you bring a bow to a nuke fight?" philosophy. If the previous spread was about finesse, this is strictly about ensuring that whatever lurks behind that pixelated, fog-choked tree line is turned into absolute fertilizer. They really commit to this tactical framing, talking about kickback and reload times like they were writing a military manual for a seasoned special operative, rather than providing advice for a game where you jump around like a manic gazelle just to avoid the engine's frame rate drops. Take the shotgun, for instance. Comparing the kickback to a geography-level scale like Greenland is some classic magazine hyperbole, but I suppose they were desperate to make simple mechanics sound like an existential threat. Firing that thing had a certain clunky weight that actually defined what we expected from a shooter in early 1997. It felt dirty, loud, and incredibly satisfying, even if your hit detection occasionally felt like a coin flip. Then there's the "look how smart we are" section regarding the energy weaponry. The description of the minigun consuming prey in a blanket of green light is pure, unfiltered dramatic license. It's hilariously over the top, describing these furious green lasers as some elegant high-tech solution to wildlife management, but you can't really blame them. After all, that was the appeal. We weren't just playing a game, we were effectively walking around with handheld nukes that could evaporate the opposition. The references to Doom in the automatic shotgun entry are about as subtle as a sledgehammer, rightfully acknowledging the elephant in the room that even Turok owed its soul to that earlier design philosophy. The real spectacle, though, is the quad rocket launcher. They frame it as a well-earned rest from the lasers, but let's be honest, it was the panic button. When you were overwhelmed by a small army of soldiers, accuracy was just a pipe dream. This weapon wasn't about refined tactics, it was about mass destruction. It turned everything it hit into a spectacular light show of grey smoke and orange blocks, even if the projectile speed meant you had to lead your shots like you were playing an intergalactic version of lawn darts. It's charming how they treat the grenade launcher's physics like a technical marvel too, ignoring that the projectiles acted more like erratic, bouncing rubber balls that loved to settle in the worst possible places. And finally, slipping in the tip about the pen and ink mode via the cheat menu. That was gold. Finding out you could toggle the game to look like a raw, wireframe developer build made you feel like you'd broken into the actual coding department. Sure, it likely induced eye strain, but in a world before the internet fully spilled all the secrets, finding a hidden visual filter made you the undisputed champion at school the next day. The next spread continues the armory obsession, focusing on the heavy hitters that cemented the game's reputation as a playground for destructive impulses. The editorial team is practically swooning over the high-tech toys on display, which is fair considering just how cathartic they were to deploy. The particle accelerator is framed as the peak of tactical engagement, functioning effectively as an icebox for local predators. Turning hostile fauna into fragile ice sculptures to be shattered at will is clearly a mechanical highlight. Then, the fusion cannon enters the conversation, essentially acting as a portable disaster zone. The writing team correctly identifies the allure. There's a distinct brand of digital nihilism in wiping out a swathe of enemies with a single pull of the trigger. It wasn't about refined combat, it was about projecting absolute power. Environmental consequences be damned. Finally, the elusive chronoceptor makes its appearance as the ultimate reward for collecting those 8 troublesome fragments. They acknowledge the design philosophy here perfectly. It takes the greatest hits of the other weaponry and synthesizes them into one unrivaled screen-clearing juggernaut. Looking at that 91% verdict, it feels entirely representative of the era. Back when titles lived or died by their moment-to-moment playability, praising the mastery and satisfying combat loop was the only correct call. The reviewer's commendation of the devastating power and brilliantly accurate sound design rings true. If you could overlook the inevitable thick fog used to save the N64's processor from an embarrassing meltdown, the combat rhythm was genuinely impeccable. It really was less about being a calculated jungle ranger, and more about managing an infinite supply of ballistic superiority against creatures that never really stood a chance. As for the right page, this is a Blaze advertisement showcasing essential N64 hardware add-ons, including 1MB memory cards, universal game adapters, and various A/V and SCART cabling solutions for improved image quality. The next page finds us eagerly dissecting Mario Kart 64 during those agonizing, long-winded months where the rest of us were still stuck reading about how much fun everyone else was having in Japan or the US. It's early 1997, and let's face it, waiting for a PAL release was essentially an exercise in character-building masochism. The magazine staff, clearly unable to deal with the withdrawal, decided that rather than suffer in silence, they'd get their mitts on an import copy and flaunt it for the rest of us to salivate over. And frankly, they were right to be impatient. This wasn't just another racer, it was the main event. While the review itself acknowledges the weird technical compromise of using 2D sprites for the racers, while racing on 3D geometry, a slightly clunky bridge between the SNES past and this burgeoning polygonal future, it barely mattered once you picked up a controller. Looking back at how they obsess over the visual performance, it's charmingly quaint. Yes, those characters rotate like stiff pieces of cardboard if you stare too hard, but when the game hit those frenetic speeds, your eyes were too busy scanning for oncoming hazards to worry about pixel fidelity. The true focus, and where the article rightly pours its adoration, is the multiplayer. In 1997, cramming 4 mates around a screen was the ultimate status symbol of your living room, even if it necessitated a massive telly, which, for most, was still a hulking box of electronics that took up half the floor space. This is where the reputation was forged. It wasn't about refined driving or technical track analysis, it was about the exquisite, cold-blooded psychological warfare of drifting Wario or Donkey Kong into a well-placed banana peel just before the final corner. They rightly note that the sound design does heavy lifting here. If you've spent any time with this game, you know the sound bites are seared into your memory for life. The mocking laughs and aggressive shouts that define the experience as much as the tires screeching. This spread acts as a testament to why the title held us in a stranglehold. The pure, unbridled engagement of human versus human competition remains undefeated. They had the right idea. Focus on the, shall we say, social interactions it encourages. Forget the 90s corporate veneer of gaming. This was about ensuring the person sitting on the sofa next to you felt the full, unfiltered impact of a perfectly timed blue shell. That's not just a game feature, it's a lifestyle choice. This page sees our intrepid editors breaking down the driver roster and course list, attempting to apply something resembling logic to the delightful vehicular assault that is Mario Kart 64. You've got the full spread here, a mini masterclass on weight distribution that almost makes you believe you can play strategically, rather than just desperately clawing for an item box. Let's look at the drivers first, a motley crew if ever there was one. They've gone and divided the cast into sensible grounded science, mostly accurate really. You've got your heavies, like Donkey Kong and Wario, effectively functioning as steel-plated oil tankers on wheels. Sure, you'll get squashed, but good luck trying to make a hairpin turn without swinging into the local countryside. On the flip side, we have the lightweights, Toad and Peach. They accelerate like a nervous cat but are so incredibly frail you'd expect them to fly off the track if someone even looked at them the wrong way. The middle ground remains the preserve of Mario and Luigi, for those players who lack the ambition to either bulldoze their rivals or twitch their way to victory. Then there's the course tour. They highlight classics like the track here labeled as Noko Noko Beach, the Japanese moniker reminding us just how foreign and exotic these screens felt at the time, and that dusty, interminable circuit known as Kalimari Desert. Seeing these screens now, one cannot help but laugh at how primitive the flat, textured environments look in comparison to modern wizardry, yet at the time, this was the pinnacle of home entertainment. Those low-res textures were glorious to our younger selves, and who really cared about technical fidelity when the main goal was figuring out the exact millisecond to blast a shell at your mate's rear bumper. The centerpiece here, however, is the section dedicated to Kart to Kart. This isn't just about gameplay, it's about acknowledging the absolute engineering trickery required to keep a 4-player screen running on the hardware. You can almost feel the writer trying to gloss over the performance dips, noting the odd vanishing obstacle here and there, and the general blurring that occurs when everyone piles onto one track. But for a console in 1997, pulling off that split-screen view while managing 4 independent human inputs was basically black magic. The trade-off was minimal, and the sacrifice of visual sharpness a small price to pay to ensure our friendships remain suitably combustible for the duration of a tournament. Next we have a crash course in vehicular aggression that demands we treat drift cornering less like a simple steering input and more like an art form. Mastering that rhythmic hop, holding the R button for dear life, and angling for that telltale plume of yellow tire smoke was essentially the entry exam for any serious racer. Fail to perfect that maneuver, and you were nothing more than a slow-moving chicane for the rest of the pack, doomed to witness everyone else's triumph while you struggled to hold a line around a standard curve. It is charming to look back at these specific circuit breakdowns. They highlight Cooper Castle, a track that served as a cruel teacher for anyone too impatient to dodge the thwomps. Those blocks didn't just squash you, they humiliated you in real time, right in front of your friends. Then you had Donkey Jungle Park, with its ambitious water features and those precarious uphills. Back then, simply managing to navigate the bridge without falling into the stream felt like a technical achievement on par with flying a plane. Then we have Yoshi Valley, arguably the game's biggest prank on the player base, giving us a multi-pathed labyrinth and then wiping the map screen blank to create total bewilderment. It was evil design in the best way possible. Watching the huge egg rolling about, knowing you could hit a wrong turn and find yourself completely lost, turn that course into a high-stakes guessing game. And who could overlook the Rainbow Road endurance test? It was long, dizzying, and utterly unforgiving. Missing the initial jump was the universal signal that your race was over, a singular mistake that sent you plummeting into a colorful void while the pack left you behind. Moving over to Time Attack, the analysis here perfectly captures the neurotic obsession that took hold of us all in '97. Trying to shave mere fractions of a second off a track time led to legitimate mental breakdowns. The sheer anxiety surrounding the speed start alone was enough to end a friendship. You had to nail that ignition timing perfectly, or your entire lap attempt was cursed before the wheels even started spinning. There was no joy, only the desperate, calculated search for the perfect racing line, hoping against hope to hit that magic target time. Finally, we arrive at the battle game, the real meat of the console experience. It's almost adorable how the writer apologizes for the slightly wider arenas and the occasionally sluggish pace compared to previous entries. We didn't care about the slightly nerfed intensity. Dragging the battle game from tiny screens to these sprawling multi-tiered arenas made every encounter feel significant. You weren't just playing a race, you were stalking prey through blocky corridors. Sure, maybe the shells felt a bit too spread out and rare, but that just added to the tension of keeping your last, flickering balloon. When you held that final balloon, while your opponents had been turned into walking time bombs, it was the closest thing to digital dominance. This section doesn't just explain the game, it exposes the exact atmosphere of every living room during the late 90s, where losing meant immediate demand for a rematch. The next page serves as the ultimate manual for anyone trying to navigate the tactical minefield that was mid-90s arcade driving, and looking back, it really frames just how much weight we placed on understanding the inventory management system. We aren't just talking about steering left or right here. This was a war of attrition, where success depended on how efficiently you could utilize the cart attack section provided. Holding an item, specifically those banana skins, by using the Z trigger was less of a feature and more of a mandatory survival skill. If you were driving along and simply firing items the second you grabbed them, you were telegraphing your position to the entire lobby, effectively handing your win over to someone who had actually read the guide and understood the concept of defensive shell deployment. It wasn't about racing, it was about holding the line. The accompanying text perfectly captures the vibe of the 1997 import culture. Remember the era? Spending a small fortune to have an N64 unit smuggled in from across the globe, just so you could get your hands on this before it officially touched UK soil. That excitement was unparalleled. The author's honest admission that initial look of suspicion really rings true for everyone who had been riding the SNES high. Looking at screenshots that seemed to lean on the aesthetic of pre-rendered digitized characters, similar to the DKC era of sprites, felt somewhat familiar, causing that momentary pang of fear that Nintendo was just serving us an old game in a new hat. How wrong everyone was. The sheer complexity hidden behind that colorful, bright veneer was entirely deceptive. It is brilliant to see how they handled the transition to true 3D in their assessment. The reviewer mentions the concern about it feeling like a simple port, but correctly pivots to the realization that the game opened up significantly once you grasped the sheer scale of the courses and the nuance of the handling. It was a technical shift, not just an aesthetic one. When they speak of it being the ultimate racing game, it wasn't just hype, it was the consensus. You weren't playing against computerized drones. You were playing against friends who had spent their entire afternoon practicing those same drifting inputs on the practice courses until their thumbs were sore. The verdict here is a confident 91%, which, if you were around at the time, felt exactly like the grade such a social titan deserved. The reviewers essentially highlight what made this a generational experience. That mix of accessibility for your younger sibling who couldn't steer straight, and the ruthless efficiency required for the time attack aficionados. It was the only title where you could be in a room full of people screaming, throwing down their controllers, and demanding a rematch until the sun came up, all while swearing that the AI had been specifically programmed to hate them. Looking at this page today, it reminds you that the actual beauty of this era wasn't the polish of the visuals, though they did hold up better than most at the time. It was that it didn't feel like work. You were being tested, sure, but you were being tested with style. A classic page for a definitive title that basically owned the local multiplayer circuit for years to follow. This page introduces us to Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey, a title that serves as a jarringly energetic reminder of how desperate developers were to shove every genre, especially sports, into the strange new realm of early 3D polygons. One can't help but look at those screenshots, where the players look less like legendary Canadian athletes, and more like something crafted in a high-speed accident involving plasticine and radioactive waste, and chuckle. It was an absolute riot, really. You have to understand, during that period we weren't just playing games, we were essentially test pilots for whatever Midway thought constituted a next-gen hockey experience. The idea of mutant players, where you could inflate their craniums like party balloons, was less a legitimate game feature and more of a late-night prank gone wrong, but that was precisely the sort of off-kilter design that made owning a machine like the Nintendo 64 feel worth the struggle. The critique provided in the review hits the nail on the head. The game is shockingly fast. If you were looking for the cerebral, simulation-heavy tactical gameplay that PC fans were boasting about with their statistical databases, you came to the wrong console. What the N64 gave us instead was, essentially, ice hockey at Mach 4, with enough flaming pucks and crunching, wincing impacts to keep a whole group of mates thoroughly entertained until the early hours. When the reviewer talks about ad hoc teams and the feeling of those bodies slamming together, they capture that primitive kinetic energy that defined the platform's early lifespan. Giving it 70% feels harsh by today's standards, perhaps, but back then, you wanted polish and depth. While this had the flair, it was admittedly a bit of a chaotic blur. The contrast between this and the simulation games was stark, yet it held its own as the arcade alternative you kept in the rotation when you were bored of playing sensibly. Looking at these adverts for Excitement Direct and Project A brings back that distinct mid-90s headache of waiting weeks for a grey import from Hong Kong or the States. You had these pages with lists of tantalizing, unreachable games that hadn't even scratched the surface of the European release window. We relied on these trade suppliers as if they were clandestine arms dealers, just so we could get our hands on the latest cartridges before the local rental store even bothered to stock them. They weren't just retailers, they were the lifeline that prevented the Nintendo 64 library from feeling like a desolate, empty wasteland during those long waits for official local availability. It was the thrill of the hunt, reading through those price lists, praying the exchange rates hadn't ruined your pocket money stash, and waiting by the postbox for a package that looked like it had survived a transoceanic flight and possibly a war. It wasn't the most elegant way to play, but when the game arrived, that first load on your own TV was unparalleled. The next page presents us with Killer Instinct Gold, or as some of us less than kind players might call it, Killer Instinct. Slightly sharper, but still boring. We all held on to that desperate hope that Rare, having already given us that plumber-size revolution in 3D, could somehow wave a magic wand and replicate that gorgeous, pre-rendered arcade carnage on our CRT screens. And, well, let's just say, reality arrived to shatter the illusion with the force of a concrete slab. What you have here is an object lesson in why high-fidelity sprites, while stunning in a bustling arcade next to a loud music machine, often look like absolute mush on a television. There is a strange, disconnect-ridden misery to these visuals. Characters looking like plastic figurines that were left too close to a radiator and melted into distorted, squat monstrosities. The reviewer here is refreshingly honest. The game tries to disguise its limited gameplay depth with the gimmick of lengthy, overcomplicated combos. You weren't playing a tactical fighting game, you were essentially practicing how fast your fingers could drum on a piece of hard plastic to ensure the enemy stayed stuck in the corner. The sheer audacity of including a detailed training mode in the game itself screams an apology before you've even picked up your first character. If you need a digital instructor to explain how the mechanics function just to make the game playable, it suggests the combat has strayed far from intuitive brilliance and headed straight into rote memorization. And honestly, isn't that the real disappointment here? It lacks the soul of a proper home title. It feels like a port dragged onto the hardware, just because the brand carried enough weight to push boxes, not because the conversion added anything resembling substance. The verdict of 62% hits with the precision of a guillotine. Back in 1997, numbers didn't lie. You were either a must-have, 80s masterpiece, or you were shelf filler. Watching the reviewer struggle to find kind words amidst the inevitable criticisms regarding the repetitive gameplay and the dated aesthetics highlights the gulf between arcade glory and home console endurance. It simply lacked the staying power. While it filled a hole in the release schedule, for those who truly understood how a fighting game should reward instinct over sheer muscle memory, it left a sour taste. It stands as a reminder that even from the geniuses at Rare, we were sometimes served reheated leftovers disguised as the main course. Fascinating curiosity, perhaps, but certainly not the champion of the fighting arena we were promised. The next page pulls us from the arcade wreckage and dumps us straight onto the pitch with J-League Perfect Striker. If you were kicking around in 1997 with nothing but a platformer to keep your console fed, the arrival of a serious Konami football title felt like the heavens opening. This, of course, was the secret sauce, the glorious blueprint that would eventually arrive on our shelves as the legendary International Superstar Soccer 64, a game that arguably became a religion in households across the country. The magazine's verdict is rightfully glowing, and honestly, they aren't overselling it. What makes this title a watershed moment isn't the license glitz of the J-League teams. Let's be frank, most of us spent hours squinting at the roster names, wondering exactly who we were controlling, but the sheer, unbridled fidelity of the physics and gameplay. We are looking at the introduction of the response sound system. It sounds like pure marketing PR fluff, but playing it felt miles ahead of the generic, tinny looping audio tracks that plagued the generation prior. Hearing the stadium atmosphere ebb and flow, shifting from an expectant buzz to a roaring crescendo the moment you finally stitched together a passing move. That was true immersion. It felt alive in a way digital football hadn't really mastered yet. Then there is the referee implementation, complete with the ridiculous, stilted theatre of the official rushing over to book you. It was pure melodrama, watching your player stand there looking sheepish as the ref brandished a card with the authority of a state magistrate. It wasn't just fancy window dressing though, those bookings forced you to play like an adult. It turned a mindless arcade kickabout into something resembling a tactical game, where you genuinely had to calculate if that aggressive sliding tackle on the edge of the penalty box was worth the inevitable suspension or booking. But the real stroke of genius, the element that truly separates the mediocre attempts from the gold standard titles, was the newfound autonomy granted to the goalkeepers. They finally felt like autonomous athletes rather than static, programmed mannequins stuck on a goal line rail. Watching a keeper sprint blindly off his line to intercept a through ball, or conversely, getting lobbed into next week because he let the adrenaline of a clean sheet go to his head, was absolutely brilliant. It turned defensive play into either a display of masterclass anticipation or a comedy of errors, depending on how heavy your thumb was. While it was essentially a testbed for the later westernized release, you have to hand it to Konami, they didn't cut corners. They shipped a tight, incredibly fun experience that laid the foundation for the absolute definitive standard of football on the machine. You remember how addictive it was. Perfect, glorious stuff. The next page transports us straight back to April 1997, an era where owning an N64 meant your football cravings were restricted to either enduring atrocious arcade junk or desperately sourcing an import copy of J-League Perfect Striker. It's a quaint slice of gaming history that really captures how thirsty we were for a proper, functioning football sim on the 64-bit hardware. We were, quite literally, buying import games and staring blankly at Japanese character menus just because the gameplay loop was even by 1997 standards utterly magnificent. Let's be honest, we didn't import it for the thrill of the J-League's illustrious rosters. You'd be hard-pressed to name 3 players from the entire lineup, but we tolerated the language barrier because Konami had managed to bottle the elusive sensation of proper movement physics. This wasn't just pixels kicking a static ball, it was the start of something serious. The magazine's reviewers were clearly enamored, dishing out a glowing 89% score that felt entirely justified at the time. Watching the goalkeepers actually rush off their line to challenge a striker, rather than standing rooted to the turf like a redundant garden gnome, was a revelation. It transformed the defensive game from a scripted formality into a tactical, slightly frantic decision-making exercise. However, the experience wasn't without its faults, most notably the laughable scoring difficulty. You could, quite comfortably, thrash teams by double figures if you had half a thumb to work the D-pad. It was essentially an offensive training ground where defenders were barely optional scenery. The reviewers noted it, we knew it, yet we played it anyway because the sheer fluid animation made the game look spectacular. Seeing a striker plant and volley in the back of the net, complete with proper motion-captured movement, provided a level of satisfaction that made you forget you had absolutely no clue what you were clicking in the Japanese option menus. That, and the caption writing team's hilariously dated cultural humor, referencing the Rice Boy scoring serves as a firm reminder that editing standards in 1997 were, well, significantly more, shall we say, blunt. The real anticipation, though, was anchored to that little sliver of promise on the right, International Superstar Soccer 64. That upcoming summer release was the holy grail we were waiting for. The prospect of having the exact same engine, but with the sensible, localized European teams we actually knew and an interface in our own tongue, was enough to keep any self-respecting football fan counting the weeks. We knew Konami had found the perfect blueprint. We were just killing time, waiting for the full-fat, authentic version to arrive, so we could properly lose ourselves in those virtual stadiums. It was a golden time of hopeful, eager anticipation for what everyone realized was going to be the definitive benchmark for the machine. The next page pulls back the heavy, almost comically guarded curtain surrounding Konami's KCEO studio in Osaka. We're treated to an audience with the architects behind International Superstar Soccer 64. Back in the spring of '97, reading about the major team was less like a standard interview and more like a dispatch from an exotic, secretive kingdom. The dedication on display is enough to make a modern developer shudder. We aren't talking about early access patches here. These poor souls were essentially living under lock and key, with our reporter practically staging an espionage-style escape just to get the story, bluffing their way past security with the excuse of an urgent bathroom trip. What really stood out at the time wasn't just the sheer arrogance of a developer working in a secured fortress, but the obsession with realism that feels charmingly quaint today. They spent months capturing motion not of pro athletes, mind you, but of their own staff. Recording hundreds of distinct movements to make virtual players lunge and dash properly wasn't just a gimmick, it was a crusade against the static, wooden animation that plagued earlier football titles. When you see the comparisons to the SNES era, you get a genuine sense of the leap we were experiencing. These developers weren't shy about boasting that the N64's architecture, the infamous 64-bit muscle, allowed their AI to calculate results hundreds of times faster than anything the 16-bit consoles could muster. To us, sitting with our pads and squinting at a CRT television, that technical muscle felt like real sorcery. It's also worth appreciating the pragmatism regarding the cartridges. Everyone loved to sneer at Nintendo's medium, cursing the limited memory and storage space compared to the bloated, slow-loading seasons on competing hardware. Yet these developers argued that it was actually a godsend for gameplay speed. While they weren't exactly hiding their frustrations with memory management, they viewed those limits as a hurdle to clear, rather than a reason to fail. They were crafting an experience where the player could dive into a match immediately, without staring at a loading bar for half a lifetime. Ultimately, the takeaway from this feature was the shift from J-League to the full glorious realization of ISS-64. They explain how transforming that Japan-only build into the international sensation involved everything from skin tone tweaks to rebuilding stadiums from scratch. Reading this felt like watching the blueprints being laid for a monument we knew we were going to sink hundreds of hours into. It reassured us that we weren't just playing a reskin of a niche title, but a global heavyweight in the making, designed with a fanatical eye for detail that would soon redefine our weekend rituals. Knowing these were the guys who sweated over every individual player movement gave us full confidence that our summer was going to be entirely monopolized by the virtual pitch. The next page lands with the grace of a brick, and unfortunately for those of us clutching our N64 controllers with wide-eyed expectation, we're staring at the catastrophe that is Mortal Kombat Trilogy. To call this an insult would be a charitable assessment. Reading through this, it's clear the editors weren't just mildly annoyed, they were frankly offended by what they were sold. You see this 34% score, and wonder why Nintendo allowed such a hack job to grace their machine in the first place. When you flip the page and see the words, "a blend of the finest," it really feels like a cosmic joke, because what we actually got was a dismembered, sluggish mess that had no business being ported this way. We were living in a time when every developer with a dev kit was desperate to claim they had the definitive version of their game on the cartridge format, but this effort essentially shames the console's architecture. You remember the anticipation, we were all craving a brutal fighter to sink our teeth into, but the reviewers make it abundantly clear that this wasn't the feast we were promised. It felt like someone tossed an arcade board into a blender, smashed the bits onto a chip, and hoped the N64's mythical power would just mask the abysmal frame rate and muffled audio. The feature they call the aggressor mode is particularly grating. It feels less like an exciting new addition, and more like a desperate attempt to add seasoning to a dish that had already gone off. Nobody asked for shadows that make the screen look like a garbled mess of pixels. They wanted the snappy, visceral combat that the arcade versions had pioneered. Instead, we were served a port that felt like it was wading through molasses, stripped of the polish that gave the other versions their teeth. It's truly cringe-inducing when you look at the technical breakdown. This was meant to be a showcase of home gaming, yet it was being trounced by the fluidity found elsewhere. If you take a look at the sidebar featuring alternatives, you see the grim reality of the situation. While the magazine rightly highlights titles like Killer Instinct Gold as genuine contenders that proved the N64 was more than capable of handling high-octane fighting, Trilogy was clearly just spinning its wheels in the mud. Whether it's the lack of animation frames or the absolute state of the audio, every inch of this page screams buyer beware. The consensus was unified: don't touch this with a barge pole. While we were all desperate for a deep brawler, this just served as a reminder that not everything deserves a place in our collection, and the 34% rating acts as a very sturdy, final lock on the door for anyone considering renting this waste of plastic. It really puts into perspective how hard some studios worked to optimize games for our system, versus those who clearly couldn't be bothered to try. The next spread is a 1-2 punch of absolute mediocrity, leaving us with two titles that perfectly illustrate the early teething pains of 3D gaming. First up is The Glory of St. Andrews, which ironically carries about as much glory as a wet, miserable afternoon on the actual course. The review here pulls back the curtain on a title that is, at its heart, just a basic 16-bit simulation wearing a poorly tailored 3D mask. You can practically hear the reviewer sighing at the graphical fidelity. The clipping issues alone make the entire game look like an unfinished tech demo rather than a polished release. It's the kind of game that pretends to be a refined golf simulation but lacks the tactile satisfaction of a real swing mechanic. They were quite right to point out that despite all the talk of sophisticated 3D models and terrain features, it was just a dull slog. When the most memorable aspect of a golf game is an oddly shifting hole graphic, or an excitable golfer in a sweater, you know the developer missed the mark. At 58%, it sits right on that painful fence of not quite being broken, but certainly not being fun. Then we veer violently into the automotive catastrophe that is Cruisin' USA. Talk about a sobering experience. The suggestion on the page that this was the only alternative to the king of the kart races is genuinely laughable in hindsight. The reviewers didn't just dislike it, they dissected the carcass. They highlight a port that clearly stripped out every ounce of adrenaline the arcade version possessed, leaving behind a husk of a game that suffered from a sluggish framerate, hideous scenery, and physics that treated bridges and barriers more like suggestion than collision. It is a harsh but necessary assessment. In the early days, we all wanted our arcade favorites at home, but this really proves that some things don't travel well across the Atlantic when handled by studios who clearly weren't sweating the details. They quite ruthlessly tear into the gameplay mechanics, pointing out that what should have been a white-knuckle racing experience ended up being a dull grind of constant collision errors. Watching the screenshots of this version against the vibrant, punchy reality we knew we could have is painful. It really drives home the buyer beware attitude that we all eventually adopted. That 34% score acts like a giant flashing neon sign warning anyone with a brain cell to walk away. While we were all dreaming of speed, we were instead given a game that felt like it was wading through a vat of glue. It's an embarrassing relic that highlights exactly why porting was such a massive hurdle back then. Some teams just didn't have the stomach to translate speed onto a cartridge. A pale shadow indeed, and one we were all too happy to leave in the dust while waiting for something that actually performed. The next page takes us straight into the import arena, a dusty corner where we typically find the weirdest, most baffling curiosities of the Japanese N64 catalog, and frankly, where common sense usually goes to perish. Starting with Mahjong Master, we hit the gaming equivalent of finding a stack of library finds in your mailbox. Seriously, who looked at the power of the N64, a machine theoretically capable of rendering revolutionary 3D vistas, and decided that the best use of that hardware was digital table games? The review quite correctly observes the sheer audacity of this release. Unless your evenings are incomplete without hearing the clack of simulated tiles in a language you likely cannot read, this serves as nothing more than a high-tech screensaver. A score of 69% for what is essentially a glorified, static spreadsheet. Let's just say the reviewer was in a charitable mood. Down on the court we encounter NBA Hangtime, the quintessential example of the port syndrome that haunted us in the mid-90s. The critique here is cutting precisely because it highlights the fundamental malaise of playing imports that offered no meaningful leap forward. Sure, it is a faithful arcade recreation, lightning fast and capable, but playing this on the N64 felt like using a rocket to boil a kettle. It's technically sound, and the basketball enthusiasts might find the pace familiar, but the enthusiasm in the review is flatter than a punctured tire. It really puts into perspective the frustration we felt when developers ported games without evolving them, serving up an as-is experience when we were hungry for the next technological revolution. It plays, it dribbles, it shoots, and yet it feels remarkably hollow compared to the heavy-hitting titles we knew were lurking just over the horizon. And then, the crown jewel of our disappointment, Wonder Project J2. This is the absolute peak of buyer beware. From afar, look at the screen grabs. The character design is crisp, the colors pop with an anime-style vibrancy that made our Western counterparts look like damp sponges in comparison. It was practically begging to be imported. Yet, the review dismantles this facade with surgical precision. Playing a father figure to a finicky, temperamental robot girl, essentially trapped in a navigational maze while deciphering an impenetrable foreign text, turns what looks like a masterpiece into a monotonous chore. It captures the struggle perfectly. You're looking at what is visually a triumph, but mechanically a slog. That 55% score represents the painful transition from the desire to play a unique, imported adventure to the harsh reality of struggling with game design that just isn't designed for a Western audience. Sometimes, the dream of an import is vastly better than the actual gameplay. The next page pulls us deeper into the import arena, that bizarre stretch of our magazine dedicated to the titles we could see, but probably couldn't play without a headache. Nestled between a relentless barrage of advertisements is Imagineer's King of Pro Baseball. Imagineer clearly decided that on a machine capable of building immersive 3D worlds, the The best aesthetic choice for their baseball debut was to transform professional athletes into balloon-headed, tiny-legged caricatures. It's visually ridiculous, honestly, and fitting for a title that never had a snowball's chance in hell of reaching a Western retail shelf. The review hits the nail on the head. It's technically proficient, arguably even fun, if you ignore the barrier of an entirely Japanese interface, but it's fundamentally hollow. Seeing the in-game screenshots, you have to appreciate the audacity of the era. We were starved for content, constantly waiting for the next big release, and developers were tossing out these localized, fat-headed simulations like it was standard practice. Giving this a 68% score feels about right. It's that awkward middle ground where it isn't an unmitigated disaster, but it's certainly not worth the hefty £50 import tax you'd pay back then. We've all seen people dump money on these curiosities, just to have something different to pop in the slot, only to find the game-breaking language barrier kills any enjoyment after 20 minutes. It's a curio, a conversation starter for your collection, and absolutely nothing more. As for the rest of this page, it serves as a snapshot of a frantic retail climate, crowded with various shops hawking consoles, cartridges and imports, capturing the expensive, slightly frantic energy of trying to stay ahead of the game curve before global release dates finally did us all a favor. The next page is your typical tips extra cheat code buffet, essentially the only way most of us stood a fighting chance in Mortal Kombat trilogy back in '97. It's packed with the usual suspect titles like Cruisin' USA, Pilot Wings 64, and Wave Race 64. We've all been there, eyes glued to the page in the low light, furiously hammering away at the D-pad just to unlock a secret move or a decent vehicle. It's classic, crunchy content that harkens back to a time when discovering a hidden mechanic felt like you'd unlocked the Holy Grail rather than just stumbling upon it online. That little Top 10 Tips box at the bottom is an adorable relic of pre-internet reader engagement, essentially begging the readership to do their editorial heavy lifting for them. Just type the codes in, save yourself the frustration, and try not to embarrass yourself by missing a simple Mortal Kombat finishing move. Next we have the Nintendo Hotline, an absolute beacon of hope for any frustrated player in 1997, with access to a landline and no qualms about bankrupting their parents for the sake of one elusive power star. Looking at the glossy, printed desperation of these questions, you really get a sense of how isolated we were back then. You didn't just hop onto a subreddit or a wiki to solve your problems. You were either playing in total solitude, consulting a magazine like this one, or dialing 017-036-52222 and waiting for some poor chap to explain that you don't actually need Luigi to finish Super Mario 64. It's genuinely hilarious to see the queries that were deemed hotline-worthy. The desperation to find Luigi is practically iconic. That phantom plumber who supposedly lurked behind every brick wall in the castle, yet in reality was completely absent from the title. You can practically hear the collective sigh of thousands of disappointed gamers who realize that, no, you aren't missing a hidden secret, you're just chasing a ghost. Then there's the whole "my cap is gone" debacle. We've all been there, triumphantly jumping across an ice sheet in Snowman's Land, only to have some overgrown rodent steal your hat and send you spiraling into a nervous breakdown. Having to trudge back up those mountains or perform specific death-defying acts just to reclaim your dignity is exactly the kind of sadistic game design that made the 64-bit era feel so visceral. The tips section, or as I like to call it, the Fingers of Steel manual, really transports you back. Trying to pull off those Killer Instinct gold commands is less of a gaming experience and more of a test of human endurance. I remember looking at instructions for these button combinations and thinking, do I need to be a concert pianist just to play as Gargos? And don't even get me started on Cruisin' USA. I suspect most people were purely playing it just because it was an early option on the system, and forcing players to memorize arbitrary controller inputs just to see a Golden Gate Park track feels delightfully retro. The immortality trick for Mario 64, the stuff of playground legends. Collecting 1,000 coins in one go just to make Mario invincible feels less like a cheat and more like a punishment for not having better things to do with your Saturday afternoon. Though I suppose we all tried it, usually dying somewhere around the 900 coin mark just out of pure spite. There is something inherently honest about this page. It isn't about flashy DLC or season passes. It's about providing granular, sometimes redundant assistance for the sake of finishing a title that we held so dear. Whether you were searching for the pyramid's exit or just trying to work out the finer points of Cruisin' Usa's throttle mechanics, the hotline stood as a bastion of gaming order. Just don't get too caught up in the phone number. The era of calling for gaming advice was truly the final hurdle before the internet took our hand and stopped us from ever having to solve a problem ourselves again. This page serves as the official dumping ground for the 1997 Nintendo Enthusiast, a digital water cooler, where the early adopters, that courageous, gullible band of gamers who dropped an obscene amount of cash for an N64 at launch, gathered to find strength in numbers. Reading these letters is like peering into the collective psyche of a player base trying to reassure themselves that, yes, buying this console was an act of genius rather than financial ruin, while they sat on their hands waiting for more than 4 games to be released. The tone here is distinct. It is a blend of hardware insecurity and technical obsession. It is adorable to see these readers debating ARF leads and SCART connectors with the fervor of aeronautical engineers. We were all terrified of the flicker and the murky, washed-out signals that haunted our cheap tube televisions. The editors at the time had to serve as makeshift technicians, constantly explaining that no, your N64 isn't broken, it is just a product of 1997, a year when pixels were still learning how to be distinct entities. They weren't just managing a magazine. They were acting as diplomats between the console-crazed youth and the reality of cutting-edge technology that, frankly, didn't always deliver on its promises. When you drill down into the game mentions, the desperation becomes palpable. Take Wave Race 64. Every letter praises it, as if it were a divine intervention of liquid dynamics. And frankly, at the time, they weren't entirely wrong. It was the only game that actually showcased what this plastic black brick could do, beyond Mario's plumber jumps. People looked at the water reflection and felt their faces melt. Similarly, Killer Instinct Gold was hailed as a savior. We were starving for any form of fighter to rival the PlayStation crowd, and here was this flashy, digitized brawler that offered just enough of an edge to shut down the console snobs in the playground. It wasn't about the gameplay depth half as much as it was about having something edgy on the shelf. Then there is the persistent, lingering hope for Zelda 64. The readers treat it less like a video game and more like a holy artifact, yet to descend from the heavens. The anticipation for what would become Ocarina of Time was so bloated and aggressive that it probably contributed to the eventual headache that came from setting expectations so inhumanly high. It defined the N64 identity. We were living in the future, yet currently staring at a library where the choices were frighteningly thin, with Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, standing there as the only buffer against boredom, even if playing it was effectively squinting through a grey, smog-filled tube at pixels that looked like raptors if you squinted hard enough. These pages reveal the inherent honesty of that time. Before we could verify game quality with a 15-second search, these letters were our only barometer of what was worth playing. You read them today, and you don't just see feedback, you see the architecture of an entire gaming community built on faith, high-priced cartridges, and the collective willpower to convince your parents that a cartridge console was a legitimate long-term investment. The next page welcomes us into the thick of the Club 64 arena, an absolute sanctuary of 1997-era optimism and the specific brand of fan entitlement that only early adoption can breed. It's fascinating, in a grim way, reading the feedback. We weren't just gaming, we were campaigning. Watching readers squabble over cover design or hunt down specific plastic-colored controllers like they were holy relics really grounds you in that specific era of consumerism. You weren't just a gamer, you were a pioneer struggling with hardware cables and searching for a signal that didn't look like a Monet painting smeared through a kitchen sieve. And then we get to the Dream On feature, a quintessential snapshot of gamer delusion at the time. These kids were essentially writing out their wish lists to Santa, asking for World War I fighter sims and expansive, groundbreaking RPGs, oblivious to the fact that developers were still struggling to figure out how to put a decent camera behind a jumping plumber, let alone simulate complex aircraft aerodynamics. Reading about someone pleading for airframe stress features in a flight simulator while they were restricted to, essentially, a flying wedge with textures, is the perfect example of the hardware being forced to overpromise. The contrast between these complex, sprawling game pitches and the reality of the console's limited launch library is tragicomedy at its finest. The letters themselves drip with a weird desperation for validation. The complaints about Mario 64 penguins, or the intense frustration of a control scheme that would feel like ancient history to anyone raised on dual analogs, highlights the sheer grit we had to cultivate. There is also the blatant dissatisfaction with the state of the catalogue. A reader taking the magazine to task because Wave Race 64 didn't provide enough long-term substance is honestly the most honest assessment of the launch period I have ever seen in print. It was a beautiful tech demo, sure, but after the first 20 hours the reflection on the water got boring, and you were stuck waiting for someone to build a game that actually pushed the boundaries of logic and content. This page features a standard mail-order advert for Special Reserve, serving as the essential, if rather dry, lifeline for readers desperate to import Japanese games or stock up on accessories to fill their N64 setup, assuming they had any cash left. The next page brings us to the directory, essentially the tactical battlefield for your weekly allowance. If you were sitting there with a clenched wallet and a desperate need to avoid wasting 70 quid on a clunker, this was where you looked first. In the pre-internet age, relying on these blurbs was less of a convenience and more of a life or death decision, especially when dealing with the murky waters of import gaming. Let's look at the titans first. Super Mario 64 was the undisputed monarch of the catalogue. Reading the review, it's clear the mag treated it like gospel. It's not just a game, it's the standard against which everything else was failing, sometimes quite miserably. It makes me smile to look at Pilot Wing 64 again. Remember, for the early adopters, it was all we had. It wasn't a revolution, but at the time, seeing that water physics in the opening level was enough to convince us that the future of gaming was actually happening, even if the fun factor plummeted once the novelty of landing a parachute wore off. Then there's Shadows of the Empire, the game that perfectly encapsulated the Panna, Luke Skywalker simulator we didn't know we wanted, though it did lose steam remarkably quickly once the Hoth stage ended. And Turok, Dinosaur Hunter? Acclaim's crown jewel of graphical prowess. We tolerated that diabolical frame rate for the sole sake of vaporizing lizards with absurdly large cannons. It was the epitome of early 3D, look at the tech, don't mind the polygons, gameplay. It feels like a lifetime ago, when getting an annulled frame rate of something close to playable felt like a grand technical achievement. And let's not ignore the bottom corner, Mario Kart 64. By this stage in '97, we all knew that any evening spent without it was an evening wasted. Then, there's the section of the page we all tended to ignore unless we had completely run out of games to buy, the imports. Cruisin' USA really is the classic example of an arcade disappointment masquerading as a home release. The magazine rightly points out it wasn't exactly life-changing, yet we flocked to it because of the dearth of driving options. Then we get to the absolute dross, like The Glory of St. Andrews. The magazine describing the graphics as ropey and citing it as 16-bit déjà vu is brutal, yet utterly accurate. The fact that developers were still putting out stale sports titles like that, or niche oddities like Mahjong Master, highlights how desperate we were for anything new to feed the console. Looking at this directory reminds us that while the big titles hit absolute home runs, the wider catalogue was essentially a mix of glorified tech demos and shovelware from the East, held together by expensive adapter carts that only worked if you performed a precise ritual. It was a time of thin pickings, but for the select few games that landed, life was sweet. Just don't get me started on the joy of paying for imported mediocre Japanese golf games when we should have been saving for the next heavy hitter. The next page serves as the sharp, critical gatekeeper to your console library. You have these concise, no-nonsense snapshots, which were essential back when the difference between a classic and a bin filler could be quite devastating for the monthly budget. Take NBA Hangtime as a prime example. Midway was essentially running a script at this point. Take an arcade sports game, pump the acrobatics up to unrealistic heights, and slap an N64 logo on the box. It's functional, certainly flashy enough, and fine for mindless entertainment, but it wasn't going to change the industry. Similarly, Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey appeared at a time when we weren't particularly obsessed with the sport on this side of the pond, yet everyone somehow owned a copy. It wasn't about the tactics, it was purely about smashing opponents into the barrier, and with 4 controllers plugged in, the game transformed into absolute brilliance. It's funny how a dull sport becomes high art with enough graphical grit and local multiplayer tension. Then there is the genuine titan on the page, Wave Race 64. When this landed, it was a massive wake-up call for the skeptics. Even today, the water physics remain genuinely impressive. It felt fluid, demanding, and arguably the first title to make you feel like the console was actually breathing. The magazine had the audacity to claim it was better than Mario Kart 64 in some respects. An outrageous stance, frankly, though I suppose I can understand the enthusiasm when you're mesmerized by how realistic the wake behind the jet skis looked while tackling those boys in a storm. Rounding off the section is the oddball, Wonder Project J2. You can really tell how starved we were for variety in Cherry 97, when people were willing to struggle through an entire complex simulation title entirely in Japanese, desperately trying to construct a robot girl. The effort involved to even navigate the menus meant that if you owned this, you felt like a pioneer of the underground scene, regardless of whether the gameplay actually made a lick of sense to you. It remains a fascinating relic of the period, perfectly illustrating our hunger for anything remotely foreign and exclusive, regardless of how impenetrable it was to play. As for the right-hand column, it's just a standard plea for you to subscribe and cut a deal on the monthly price, a savvy move if you were tired of wandering into the newsagents hoping a copy hadn't already sold out. The next page is a delightful bit of technical theatre that served as the perfect appetizer for those of us obsessed with how the sausage was actually made back in 1997. Lifting the lid wasn't just a puff piece about fancy plastic housing. It was our induction into the cult of Project Reality, which, for those of us barely old enough to understand computing architecture, sounded like the sort of shadowy, illicit experiment one might expect in a sci-fi thriller. Back then, the editorial team clearly assumed we all had a raging hard-on for semiconductor jargon. They weren't entirely wrong, were they? Look at that wireframe graphic overlaid on the console. It was the peak of graphic design for the mid-90s, treating the hardware like a clandestine piece of military-grade tech rather than a plastic box that just happened to house a plumber. You look at it and you think, yes, that is exactly where the sorcery happens. What's really fascinating reading it now is the sheer audacity of the premise. Silicon graphics. The heavyweights of industry. The very same masters of the universe who created the prehistoric menaces in Jurassic Park were effectively moonlighting to build a box for children. We had lived through the era of basic cartridges and 16-bit sprites, so being told this thing packed workstation-grade horsepower felt less like a commercial endeavor and more like witchcraft. The magazine frames it with a bit of necessary grit, admitting that Nintendo essentially stripped away every single non-essential component to make the machine affordable. That is just corporate code for we chopped everything off until it was just powerful enough to beat the competition. It was the ultimate flex against the 32-bit generation of the time. The market was flooded with promises of better CD-driven experiences, yet here was Nintendo looking at the future and deciding, actually, let's keep it proprietary, stick with carts, and shove a supercomputer in there. Reading through their reasoning about ruthless mass production makes you smirk. It really captures the hubris and the brilliance of Nintendo during that decade. They didn't want to win by playing the industry's rules. They wanted to buy their own hardware and hope the games followed suit. It also gives us a clear look at why the N64 holds such a peculiar, warm spot in our collective memories. We were treated like actual intellectuals, at least by the writers, who deserved to know how the polygonal engine room operated. Even if the text gets a bit deep into the weeds, the underlying message was simple. You own something extraordinary. It was the console that finally closed the gap between what you saw on the cinema screen and what you were actively ruining your eyesight on at home. Looking back, the excitement of that transition to the 64-bit era wasn't just about the games, though, obviously, Mario was the undisputed king. It was the distinct, satisfying feeling that, for a few years at least, the technology you held in your hands wasn't just a toy, it was the bleeding edge of the real world. That feeling of anticipation, waiting for the lid to reveal the magic inside, that was the defining flavor of 1997, and frankly, nothing quite replaced it afterwards. The next page functions as a forensic autopsy of the Nintendo 64, an essential glossy manual for the sort of geeky teenager who absolutely had to understand why the Project Reality box felt like a small, sentient tank sitting in the living room. It's a breakdown that treats the hardware less like a plastic console, and more like the weapon of choice for a clandestine government operative, complete with wireframe callouts that really try to sell the silicon graphics prestige. For those of us raised on the stuttering limitations of the previous generation, this technical diagram was basically religious iconography. Let's address the elephant in the room, the UK power adapter. Even back then, it was clear that European power standards were a massive chore, leading to that gargantuan heavy black brick that seemingly drew enough current to power a small suburb. The text politely glosses over the frustration, but every owner remembers the specific anxiety of balancing that absolute monolith in a plug socket, praying it wouldn't pull the entire wall plate down. And then there's the infamous growth on the controller lead, that ferrite core bump. Apparently, it was a new regulatory requirement to stop us all from accidentally frying our nervous systems while trying to jump a cart over a bridge, a fact which just screams the kind of mid-90s bureaucratic overcautiousness that took all the edge off being a gamer. The diagram does a stellar job of reminding us that the expansion port was the greatest mystery of 1997. It was an empty hole, a void staring back at us, teasing the arrival of the 64DD. We all looked at that plastic flap and assumed, based on the glossy previews in the gaming press, that some miraculous piece of hardware would one day transform our machines into, I don't know, supercomputers. Spoiler alert, for most, it just remained a slightly dust-gathering hollow. The real highlight, however, was the 4-player capability mentioned with such understated glee in the controller ports section. Back when competitors were fiddling around with separate, fragile multitaps, Nintendo simply went, "No, put 4 sockets on the front, just build it into the machine." It was a stroke of absolute genius that legitimized games like Mario Kart 64 as social, aggressive blood sports. If you didn't have 3 mates squeezed onto the sofa within weeks of launch, you were essentially doing the machine a disservice. The conception to birth timeline at the bottom is essentially a condensed war history. Reading about the death of the SNES project, you can really taste the bitterness, that awkward moment when Sony turned from a hardware partner into the terrifying enemy at the gates. Nintendo's transition from that doomed collaboration to a solo, hardware-obsessed dream team venture really highlights the massive, stubborn and brilliant hubris of the company during that golden era. They weren't just playing at games, they were trying to build a pedestal for Mario, regardless of the cost or the frantic efforts of the competition to keep up. It was a bizarre time, a moment when a console manufacturer felt like a defense contractor, and frankly, we lapped up every second of it. The next spread serves as a glossy tech fetishist deep dive into the guts of our beloved machine, masquerading as a public service announcement. It reads like an earnest manifesto from the era, attempting to explain, justify, and perhaps slightly overcompensate for why our games didn't feature hours of low-quality video sequences, or worse, those agonizing loading screens that the competition made us endure. The piece on the Reality coprocessor is genuinely adorable by modern standards. Reading about trilinear MIP mapping and Z-buffering felt, back in the day, like someone had handed us the schematics for an alien spaceship. We sat there, wide-eyed, letting the technical jargon wash over us, believing that these complex silicon operations were the magic dust that made Mario's jumps look so impossibly smooth. It's a wonderful example of late 90s marketing wizardry, dressing up raw computing power as if it was some ethereal, futuristic, and vaguely intelligent entity that only Nintendo was blessed to possess. It sold the silicon graphics dream with enough conviction that we felt sophisticated simply for owning the unit, even if, to the average layman, the whole thing sounded like science fiction gibberish. The highlight of this breakdown is undoubtedly the apologetic sermon on carts. The writers are doing heavy lifting here, spinning the limitations of our expensive, capacity-stunted storage cartridges as a daring, intentional design choice. There's something undeniably funny about the assertion that avoiding CD-ROMs was a savvy move to combat bootlegging, rather than, let's admit it, a massive logistical headache for developers and publishers alike. Yet, there's a kernel of truth buried in that spin. We did loathe the wait times elsewhere. There was a peculiar, unmatched satisfaction in shoving a cartridge into the console and being in the action in 3 seconds flat. The piece correctly points out the benefits: no disk scratching, no load times, and you have to appreciate the irony that we accepted limited textures and tinny audio, provided the gameplay loop remained immediate. The section detailing the lack of batteries in our cartridges feels like a genuine pat on the back for the engineers. Anyone who ever had a dead save battery in a beloved game, potentially losing hours of progress, knows the profound sense of betrayal that causes. Transitioning to flash memory style saving felt like entering a glorious, stress-free future. Then, there's the timeline. It's a somber look at how delayed and messy the Project Reality journey actually was. Watching those projected release windows slip from late 1994 through MID 1995 and right out to 1996 reminds us that while the result was a triumph, the waiting period was agonizing. The magazine covers it with a veneer of objective reportage, but between the lines, you can feel the frantic, nervous energy of the time. We just wanted the console in our living rooms, and we would have accepted just about any hardware excuses to get it there. It remains a fascinating autopsy of a console launch that defines the industry's shift into 3D. The next spread shifts from the silicon dreams of the internal hardware to the visceral, sometimes baffling reality of actually trying to hold, operate, and feed the machine. We've moved from technical jargon to hardware ergonomics and, quite frankly, a lesson in amateur tiny surgery. That controller, let's be honest, it looks like something discarded by an octopus, or perhaps a confused agricultural implement. Whether it was the 3 prongs that baffled everyone, or the sheer strangeness of resting your hand on a stick rather than hitting buttons, Nintendo went bold. In a landscape defined by button mashing on D-pads, that mushroom-capped analog stick was a divine revelation. Moving Mario in a full 360 degrees didn't just feel different, it rendered every other home console instantly prehistoric. Mentioning Mario Kart 64, or Turok, with this control scheme, really drives the point home. The accuracy provided by the stick was, and remains, the benchmark for movement in 3D space. It's amusing too that Nintendo made such a point of touting their different colored controllers. If you walked into a room with a translucent green or a sleek black gamepad, you were suddenly the high priest of the local gaming scene. The Z trigger tucked away on the back like some sort of secret mechanism always felt incredibly satisfying to squeeze, even if it meant performing finger gymnastics when you had to navigate that trident of a shell. It's worth acknowledging the controller pack situation here too, a necessary evil that tethered us to memory cards just to save our progress in more ambitious titles. It felt clunky at the time, but compare that to the instant save functionality we now expect, and you can see how archaic it really was. But if the left page is a lesson in ergonomics, the right page is a manual on industrial-grade masochism. The section on importing isn't just a guide. It's an indictment of the pathetic delays UK gamers had to endure in the mid-90s. We sat there, panting, while the Japanese and Americans were off racing go-karts and jumping down pipes, all while we stared at an empty shelf space in the high street. The workaround, as described here, was enough to make any sane person weep. Hacking away at the internal plastic rails of the N64, with a hacksaw, just to force an NTSC cartridge into a PAL console. The irony isn't lost on me that Nintendo built a machine they deemed too advanced to play simple discs, yet you had to take an electric saw to its insides just to make it run a game imported from abroad. That little section about swapping wires, hunting down step-down transformers to handle the voltage difference, and praying your television output wasn't rolling in a sickly hue of grayscale, is the definitive experience of the early import gamer. You weren't just playing games, you were engineering solutions to region-locking tyranny. It remains a testament to the magnetic pull of these early 3D experiences. We'd happily void our warranties, dismantle our premium equipment, and rewire our entertainment setups just for a few extra months of lead time. It's glorious madness, and it sums up the era perfectly. The next page is a launch issue competition prize, a shiny N64, massive CRT, branded chairs, plus copies of Mario Kart 64 and Mortal Kombat Mythologies to sweeten the deal. The next page serves as the menu for issue 2, highlighting the destructive satisfaction of Blast Core, which we all knew would be the destructive highlight of the month. The list is a veritable buffet of 1997 hope, featuring gems like the water physics Marvel Wave Race 64 and the questionable promise of FIFA 64, which, for the uninitiated, was better off left on the pitch. Scanning these preview lists to see which games were finally escaping the mythical import stage to reach shelves on April 24th was practically a full-time job. It's a snapshot of the excitement we felt before we realized half these games would just keep us occupied until Zelda 64 inevitably stole our souls. On the back page, you'll find a loud advert for the Mars Attacks movie release and some Babylon 5 VHS promotions, effectively acting as high-gloss clutter to separate you from your next gaming hit.